Hello everyone. Welcome to the channel. Before we dive into the horror, I know many of you watch these stories to fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to help us out. Also, it would be great if you could leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know where our stories are reaching. Hit the like button, get comfortable, and let's begin.
The soft rustle of pages and the occasional whisper were the only sounds that broke the heavy silence of the Chicago Public Library. I stood in the center of the biography section, a cart of books beside me, methodically returning each tome to its rightful place. My fingers traced the spines of books chronicling lives far more exciting than my own, a stark reminder of the mundane existence I'd fallen into. Ethan, a voice startled me from my reverie. I turned to see Sarah, my coworker, peering at me with concern etched on her face. "You've been staring at that shelf for 5 minutes. Everything okay?" I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as artificial as it felt. "Yeah, just lost in thought. You know how it is." Sarah nodded, though her eyes betrayed her disbelief. "Listen, a few of us are going out for drinks after work. Want to join? It might do you good to socialize a bit." The invitation hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I knew what they all thought of me, Ethan Parker, the reclusive librarian who preferred the company of books to people. They weren't entirely wrong. "Thanks, but I've got plans," I lied, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "Maybe next time." Sarah's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Sure, next time. Take care, Ethan." As she walked away, I felt a pang of regret. It wasn't that I didn't want friends or companionship. It was just easier this way, safer. I turned back to my cart, losing myself once more in the monotony of shelving books. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of Dewey Decimal numbers and hushed conversations with patrons. Before I knew it, the library was closing, and I found myself walking out into the chilly Chicago evening. The city was alive around me, people rushing to and fro, laughter spilling out of bars and restaurants. I hunched my shoulders against the cold, feeling more alone than ever in the midst of the bustling crowd. My apartment was a good 30-minute walk away, but I preferred it to the cramped confines of public transportation. As I walked, my mind wandered to the empty apartment waiting for me. No one to greet me, no one to ask about my day, just silence and the leftovers in my fridge. The thought sat heavy in my chest, a constant companion I couldn't shake. I was so lost in my melancholy that I almost missed it. A pair of gleaming eyes watching me from the shadows of a narrow alley. I stopped short, my heart rate picking up as I peered into the darkness. "Hello," I called out, immediately feeling foolish. It was probably just a stray dog or a soft meow answered me, and a small black cat emerged from the shadows. It was thin, its fur matted in places, but its yellow eyes were bright and alert as it regarded me warily. "Hey there, little one," I said softly, crouching down. The cat took a tentative step forward, then another. "Are you lost?" The cat meowed again, a pitiful sound that tugged at my heartstrings. Without thinking, I reached into my bag and pulled out the sandwich I hadn't eaten at lunch. It's not much, but it's better than nothing, right? I unwrapped the sandwich and tore off a small piece of turkey, holding it out to the cat. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, the cat approached and sniffed at the offering. It looked up at me, as if assessing my intentions, before delicately taking the meat from my fingers. As the cat ate, I found myself talking to it, the words spilling out unbidden. "You're probably better off than me, you know. At least you're free." Me? I'm trapped in a life I never wanted, too scared to change anything. The cat finished the turkey and looked up at me expectantly. I chuckled, tearing off another piece. "Demanding little thing, aren't you? I suppose you've earned it." being the first one to actually listen to me in, well, longer than I care to admit. I don't know how long I sat there, feeding bits of my sandwich to the stray cat and talking about nothing and everything. It was the longest conversation I'd had in months, even if it was entirely one-sided. As I spoke, I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of loneliness and frustration I hadn't even realized was there. Finally, the sandwich was gone, and the cat seemed satisfied. It rubbed against my leg, purring softly, before disappearing back into the alley. "Wait," I called out, but it was gone. I stood up, brushing off my pants, and felt an odd mixture of loss and gratitude. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty alley. The rest of the walk home felt different somehow. The city seemed a little less cold, a little less indifferent. When I finally reached my apartment building, I paused before going in, looking back in the direction I'd come from. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something in my chest. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was possibility. The thought that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. I climbed the stairs to my third-floor apartment, each step feeling lighter than the last. As I unlocked my door, I made a mental note to buy some cat food tomorrow, just in case. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about the cat, its bright eyes, the way it had listened without judgment. It was silly, I knew, to feel so affected by a chance encounter with a stray animal. And yet, I drifted off to sleep, my dreams filled with piercing yellow eyes and shadowy figures. I tossed and turned, caught in a strange landscape where alleyways stretched into infinity and disembodied voices whispered just out of earshot. In one particularly vivid moment, I saw the cat transform, growing and shifting until it became a tall, dark figure with the same gleaming eyes. It reached out to me, its form flickering between feline and human, and I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the unsettling images from my dream. It was just stress and an overactive imagination, I told myself. Nothing more. But as I finally began to drift off again, a part of me couldn't help but wonder, what if it wasn't? What if that chance encounter in the alley was the beginning of something more? With that thought echoing in my mind, I fell into a fitful sleep, unaware that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. The lonely librarian was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about reality and himself. As the first light of dawn began to creep through my curtains, I made a decision. I would go back to that alley. I would find that cat again. Little did I know, that simple decision would set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the course of my life. The alarm clock blared, startling me awake. Another day beckoned, but for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of anticipation. As I got ready for work, I found myself glancing out the window, searching the streets below for a glimpse of a small black cat. "Get it together, Ethan," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. "It's just a cat, just a stray cat." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Somehow, in the space of one evening, that cat had become a symbol of something more, possibility of change, of connection. I left my apartment that morning with a spring in my step and a bag of newly purchased cat food tucked under my arm. The lonely librarian was gone, replaced by a man on a mission to find a stray cat that, unbeknownst to me, would turn out to be so much more than it appeared. The days began to blur together, each one marked by the same anticipation that quickened my steps as I approached the alley where I'd first encountered the stray cat. It had been 2 weeks since that fateful evening, and our meetings had become the highlight of my otherwise monotonous existence. As I rounded the corner, my heart leapt at the sight of a small black figure sitting patiently at the mouth of the alley. "'Kay there, little one?" I called out softly, a smile spreading across my face. The cat, I'd taken to calling him Shadow, meowed in response, padding towards me with increasing confidence. Gone was the skittish, malnourished creature I'd first met. Shadow now sported a glossy coat and a healthier frame, thanks to our daily rendezvous. I crouched down, pulling out a small container of wet food I'd started carrying in my work bag. "Dinner time," I announced, peeling back the lid. As Shadow ate, I found myself talking, as had become our custom. "You wouldn't believe the day I had," I sighed, absently stroking his back. Mrs. Abernathy came in again, insisting we should stock more romance novels. "I swear that woman—" I trailed off, realizing I was gossiping about library patrons to a cat. But Shadow just looked up at me with those intelligent yellow eyes, as if encouraging me to continue. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if this is all there is. Wake up, go to work, come home, sleep, repeat. At least now I have you to look forward to." Shadow finished eating and rubbed against my leg, purring loudly. I chuckled, scratching behind his ears. Yeah, I hear you. You're just using me for the food, aren't you?" As if in response, Shadow headbutted my hand affectionately. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something almost human in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps? But I blinked, and he was gone. Our little routine continued for weeks, Shadow growing sleeker and more affectionate with each passing day. I found myself opening up more, not just to the cat, but at work as well. Sarah noticed the change one afternoon as we were reshelving books together. "You seem different lately, Ethan," she observed, a curious look on her face. "Happier, somehow. Did something change?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain that my improved mood was due to befriending a stray cat. "I guess I've just been trying to appreciate the little things more," I said finally. Sarah smiled warmly. "Well, whatever it is, it suits you. Hey, a bunch of us are going to that new cafe after work. Want to join?" To my own surprise, I found myself nodding. "You know what? That sounds nice. Thanks, Sarah." As I left work that evening, a light drizzle had started to fall. I hurried to the alley, worried that Shadow might not show up in this weather. But there he was, huddled under a cardboard box, looking miserable. "Oh, you poor thing," I murmured, my heart clenching at the sight. Without thinking, I scooped him up, cradling him against my chest. "Come on, let's get you somewhere dry." Shadow didn't protest, instead burrowing closer to me, seeking warmth. I could feel his rapid heartbeat against my own, and in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't just a stray cat anymore. This was my friend, and he needed me. My apartment building loomed ahead, and I made a split-second decision. "Looks like you're coming home with me tonight, buddy," I whispered, my own pulse quickening at the thought. As I climbed the stairs to my third-floor apartment, a mix of excitement and trepidation swirled in my chest. I'd never had a pet before, never been responsible for another living creature. What if I messed this up? I fumbled with my keys, trying not to jostle Shadow too much. Finally, the door swung open, and I stepped into my small, tidy apartment. "Welcome home," I said, gently setting Shadow down on the floor. He immediately began exploring, sniffing at every corner and piece of furniture. I watched him, a strange warmth blooming in my chest. For the first time in years, my apartment didn't feel empty. "Okay," I said, more to myself than to Shadow. "Food, water, litter box. We can do this." The next hour was a flurry of activity as I scrambled to make my apartment cat-friendly. I fashioned a makeshift litter box out of a shallow cardboard box and some shredded newspaper, set out bowls of food and water, and created a cozy bed from an old sweater. By the time I finished, Shadow had made himself comfortable on my couch, watching me with those enigmatic yellow eyes. I collapsed next to him, suddenly exhausted. "What am I doing?" I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I don't know the first thing about taking care of a cat. Shadow stretched and climbed into my lap, kneading my thigh before settling down. His purr rumbled through me, soothing my frayed nerves. I guess we'll figure it out together, tuh? I said, scratching under his chin. That night, as I lay in bed with Shadow curled up at my feet, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. The patter of rain against the window and the soft sound of Shadow's breathing lulled me into a deep sleep. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, I jolted awake, my heart racing. I could have sworn I heard footsteps in my living room, the soft pad of bare feet on hardwood floors. I sat up, straining my ears in the darkness. Shadow was no longer on the bed. "Shadow," I called out softly, my voice trembling slightly. Silence answered me. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every nerve on high alert. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I crept towards the bedroom door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and yanked the door open. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, and there, curled up on the couch, was Shadow. He lifted his head, blinking sleepily at me. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. "Just my imagination," I muttered, running a hand over my face. I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. By the time my alarm went off, I was exhausted, my mind spinning with half-formed thoughts and vague unease. As I got ready for work, Shadow wound around my ankles, meowing insistently. I know, I said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "I'll be back this evening, I promise." But as I closed the apartment door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The comfortable routine I'd settled into over the past weeks suddenly felt precarious, as if I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite see or understand. At work, I found myself distracted, jumping at small noises and constantly checking my phone, half expecting, what? A call from my non-existent cat sitter? A message from Shadow himself? "Deason?" Sarah's voice cut through my reverie. "Are you okay? You seem really out of it today." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well last night. Weird dreams." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "Must be something in the air. I've been feeling on edge all day too." As I walked home that evening, my steps quickened, eager to check on Shadow. But as I approached my building, a chill ran down my spine. Body for work. Last night was a misunderstanding, mass hysteria or something. It won't happen again. But as I walked to the library, I couldn't help scanning every alley, every shadowy doorway. My nerves were so frayed that when Sarah tapped me on the shoulder at work, I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Dine," she exclaimed, taking a step back. "Sorry, Ethan. Didn't mean to startle you." I forced a laugh, trying to slow my racing heart. No, it's fine. I'm just a little on edge today." Sarah's brow furrowed with concern. "You've seemed pretty stressed lately. Is everything okay?" For a wild moment, I considered telling her everything. About Shadow, about the scratches, about the figure that had chased me. But how could I explain it without sounding completely unhinged? "Yeah, everything's fine," I lied. "Just haven't been sleeping well. You know how it is." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. "Well, if you ever want to talk," I nodded, grateful for her concern even as I felt guilty for brushing her off. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it." The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, but the thought of walking home filled me with dread. I considered calling a cab but dismissed the idea as too extreme. I couldn't let this paranoia control my life. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the evening air. The street was busy with the usual after-work crowd, which I found oddly comforting. Surely nothing could happen with so many witnesses around. I was about halfway home when I saw it. The figure. It was standing across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of a building. But there was no mistaking its intent. It was watching me. My heart began to race, but this time, instead of running, I felt a surge of anger. Enough was enough. Without really thinking it through, I marched across the street, determined to confront whatever or whoever this was. "Pay!" I shouted as I approached. "Who are you? Why are you following me?" But as I drew closer, the figure seemed to shift. It was hard to describe, like trying to focus on something underwater. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I stood there, dumbfounded, staring at the empty space where the figure had been moments before. A couple walking by gave me odd looks, and I realized how strange I must appear, yelling at thin air. Shaken, I hurried the rest of the way home. Shadow was waiting for me, as always, but this time his presence didn't bring the usual comfort. As I looked into his yellow eyes, so similar to the ones I'd seen in my dreams, a chilling thought occurred to me. "It can't be," I whispered, taking a step back from the cat. "That's impossible." But was it? The scratches on the door, too high for a normal cat. The figure that appeared and disappeared at will. The strange dreams, and Shadow always there, watching with those knowing eyes. I shook my head, trying to clear it. This was madness. I was letting my imagination run wild, seeing connections where there were none. Shadow was just a cat, a stray I'd taken in out of kindness. Nothing more. And yet, as I moved through my evening routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The comfortable life I'd built for myself suddenly felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. That night, as I lay in bed with Shadow curled up at my feet, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would start researching. Folklore, urban legends, anything that might explain what was happening to me. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was not just in my head. As I drifted off to sleep, my last conscious thought was of yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. And in my dreams, I ran through endless library stacks, pursued by a shapeless shadow that always remained just out of sight. I woke with a gasp, my heart pounding. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. The apartment was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and froze. There, silhouetted in the doorway of my bedroom, was a tall, dark figure. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, it raised a hand, beckoning to me. A scream caught in my throat as I scrambled backwards, tangling myself in the sheets. I blinked hard, certain I must still be dreaming. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. But on the floor, where it had stood, was a single black cat hair. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through my curtains, I sat at my kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of me. Shadow was nowhere to be seen, but the hair I'd found lay on the table, a damning piece of evidence I couldn't ignore. "What are you?" I whispered into the empty apartment. "And what do you want from me?" Only silence answered, but I knew now that my life had irrevocably changed. The lonely librarian was gone, replaced by a man on the brink of a mystery that defied explanation. And as I sat there, watching the sun rise on a new day, I knew that I would not rest until I uncovered the truth, no matter where it led me. The library had always been my sanctuary, a place where the orderly rows of books and the hushed atmosphere brought me comfort. But now, as I moved through the stacks, reshelving returned items, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. I found myself jumping at the slightest sound, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. "Ethan," Sarah's voice made me start, nearly dropping the book I was holding. She stood at the end of the aisle, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay? You seem jumpy." I forced a smile, trying to steady my hands. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little tired, I guess." Sarah frowned, clearly not buying it. "You've been tired for weeks now. What's really going on?" For a moment, I considered telling her everything. About Shadow, the mysterious figure, the scratches on my door. But how could I explain it without sounding completely unhinged? "It's nothing really," I insisted, turning back to the shelves. "Just haven't been sleeping well lately." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You know you can talk to me, right? If something's wrong." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Sarah lingered for a moment longer, then sighed and walked away. As soon as she was gone, I sagged against the bookshelf, my heart racing. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of nervous energy. By the time I clocked out, my hands were shaking, and a dull headache throbbed behind my eyes. Instead of heading straight home, I found myself walking to a nearby park, desperate for some fresh air to clear my head. I collapsed onto a bench, watching as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass. Families were packing up picnic baskets, dog walkers were making their final rounds, and joggers pounded the paths, squeezing in one last run before dusk. Normal people living normal lives. When had my life become so far from normal? I pulled out my phone, opening the browser. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed, "Shapeshifters in folklore." The results were a mix of ancient myths and pop culture references. I scrolled through, my unease growing with each passage I read. Skinwalkers, werewolves, kitsune, cultures around the world had stories of beings that could change their form at will. But none of it felt quite right. None of it explained the strange connection I felt with Shadow, or the sense of being watched even when I was alone. A notification popped up on my phone, a reminder for my lunch break tomorrow. I stared at it, suddenly realizing how hungry I was. When was the last time I'd eaten a proper meal? As if on cue, my stomach growled loudly. A young couple walking by glanced at me, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. It was time to go home, to face whatever was waiting for me there. The walk back to my apartment felt longer than usual, each step an effort. As I climbed the stairs to my floor, a sense of dread settled over me. What would I find when I opened the door? Shadow, innocently curled up on the couch? For something else? My hand shook as I inserted the key into the lock. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark and quiet. Too quiet. "Shadow," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response. I flicked on the lights, half expecting to see the tall, dark figure standing in my living room. But there was nothing out of place. No scratches on the walls, no mysterious puddles on the floor. Just my ordinary, slightly messy apartment. And yet, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something felt off. I moved through the rooms, checking every corner, every possible hiding place. No sign of Shadow, no sign of anything unusual at all. As I stood in the center of my living room, feeling lost in my own home, a thought struck me. What if I was losing my mind? What if all of this, Shadow, the figure, the scratches, was just a product of an overworked, lonely imagination? The idea was almost a relief. If I was going crazy, at least there was a rational explanation for everything that had been happening. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. "Get it together, Ethan," I muttered to myself. "You're not crazy. You're just tired, stressed." Evro knocked. A soft meow made me look up. Shadow sat in the doorway to my bedroom, watching me with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Shadow just blinked slowly, then padded over to jump onto the couch beside me. As I absently stroked his fur, I felt some of the tension leave my body. This was real. Shadow was real. Whatever else was going on, I wasn't imagining everything. That night, as I tried to sleep, every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with half-formed theories and vague fears. When I finally did drift off, my dreams were a chaotic swirl of shadowy figures and endless chases. I woke with a start several times, certain I'd heard footsteps or whispers, only to find the apartment silent and still. By the time my alarm went off, I was exhausted, my eyes gritty and my head pounding. I stumbled through my morning routine, downing 2 cups of coffee in quick succession. As I was about to leave for work, I paused at the door, looking back at Shadow. He sat on the windowsill, silhouetted against the morning light. "Be good," I said, feeling slightly foolish for talking to a cat. "And stay a cat, okay? No shape-shifting while I'm gone." Shadow just yawned, showing a mouthful of shark teeth. For a moment, I could have sworn they looked longer, more menacing than a normal cat's. But I blinked, and they were back to normal. The workday passed in a haze of anxiety and caffeine. I found myself constantly scanning the library, looking for anything out of place. More than once, I thought I saw a tall, dark figure out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. By lunchtime, my nerves were shot. I retreated to the break room, hoping some food would help settle my stomach. As I unwrapped my sandwich, Sarah walked in. "Hey," she said, her tone cautious. "Mind if I join you?" I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Be my guest." We ate in silence for a few minutes before Sarah spoke again. "Ethan, I'm worried about you. You haven't been yourself lately. Is everything okay at home?" I stared at my half-eaten sandwich, considering my words carefully. I'm not sure," I admitted finally. "Something strange has been happening, but I don't know how to explain it without sounding crazy." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes serious. "Try me. I promise I won't judge." So I told her, "Not everything." I left out the part about suspecting Shadow of being a shapeshifter, but I told her about feeling watched, about the scratches on my door, about the figure I'd seen following me. When I finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That sounds terrifying," she said softly. "Have you considered talking to someone? A professional, I mean." I pulled my hand away, suddenly defensive. "You think I'm crazy?" "No," Sarah said quickly. "No, I don't think you're crazy. But it sounds like you're under a lot of stress, and sometimes that can make us see things that aren't there. A therapist might be able to help you sort through what's real and what's not." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Part of me knew she was right, that a rational, outside perspective might be exactly what I needed. But another part, a part that was growing stronger by the day, insisted that what was happening was beyond the realm of normal explanation. As I walked home that evening, I found myself taking a different route, doubling back on myself several times to make sure I wasn't being followed. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was exhausted and on edge. I paused outside my door, listening intently. No sounds came from inside. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Shadow was there, curled up on the couch as if he'd never moved. He lifted his head as I entered, meowing a greeting. "Hey, buddy," I said, my voice shaky. "Everything okay here?" As if in response, Shadow stretched and jumped down from the couch. He padded over to me, rubbing against my legs. Per moment, everything felt normal. Just a man and his cat, reuniting after a long day. But as I bent to pet him, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the hardwood floor, was a single long black hair. Too long to be from a cat, too coarse to be my own. I straightened up, my heart pounding. Shadow looked up at me, his yellow eyes unblinking. "What are you?" I whispered, fear and fascination warring within me. Shadow just meowed, the picture of feline innocence. But as I stood there, the long black hair at my feet, I knew that my life had irrevocably changed. The comfortable routines of the past were gone, replaced by a mystery that defied explanation. And as the sun set outside my window, casting long shadows across my apartment, I realized that I was standing on the precipice of something far beyond my understanding. Whatever was happening, whatever Shadow truly was, I was in too deep to turn back now. The paranoia that had been building for weeks settled over me like a heavy cloak, but with it came a strange sense of determination. I would uncover the truth no matter where it led me, no matter what it cost me. As I moved further into my apartment, Shadow at my heels, I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same again. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt, a moment of clarity so intense it left me breathless. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding, sweat beading on my forehead. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 3:17 a.m., its red numbers casting an eerie glow in the darkness. "It can't be," I whispered, my voice trembling. But even as I said it, I knew it was true. The cat was never around when I saw the shadowy figure. Never. I threw off the covers and stumbled to the living room, flicking on lights as I went. Shadow was curled up on the couch, his black fur a stark contrast against the pale fabric. He lifted his head, blinking sleepily at me. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Shadow just yawned, showing a mouthful of sharp teeth. I ran a shaky hand through my hair, trying to gather my thoughts. This was insane, impossible, and yet I grabbed my laptop from the coffee table and sank into the armchair, keeping one eye on Shadow as I booted up the computer. My fingers flew over the keyboard as I typed, "Shapeshifter's Cat Folklore." The search results were a mix of ancient myths and modern urban legends. I clicked link after link, my unease growing with each passage I read. Cats featured prominently in shapeshifter lore across cultures, from the Bakaniko of Japan to the cat Sith of Celtic mythology. As I read, Shadow stretched and jumped down from the couch. He padded over to me, rubbing against my legs. I flinched away, my skin crawling at the contact. "Stay back," I warned, my voice hoarse. Shadow tilted his head, looking for all the world like a confused house cat. But I wasn't fooled. Not anymore. I spent the rest of the night researching, fueled by a manic energy I'd never experienced before. By the time dawn broke, casting long shadows across my living room, I had filled a notebook with scribbled notes and half-formed theories. I called in sick to work, ignoring the concerned texts from Sarah. This was more important than shelving books or helping patrons find obscure titles. This was everything. As the day wore on, I found myself falling down a rabbit hole of increasingly outlandish theories. Alien cats, government experiments, interdimensional beings. Each idea seemed more far-fetched than the last. And yet, in the face of what I'd experienced, how could I discount any of them? Shadow watched me from various perches around the apartment, his yellow eyes never leaving me for long. I found myself talking to him, or rather, at him as I paced. "Why me?" I demanded, running my hands through my hair for what felt like the 100th time. "What do you want?" Shadow predictably didn't answer. He just blinked slowly, his tail twitching. As evening approached, I realized I hadn't eaten all day. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me that, shapeshifter or not, I was still human and had human needs. I moved to the kitchen, my eyes never leaving Shadow as I prepared a simple sandwich. As I ate, standing at the counter, a plan began to form in my mind. It was risky, potentially dangerous, but I had to know the truth. "Okay," I said, wiping crumbs from my mouth. Here's the deal. I'm going to pretend to go to sleep, and then we'll see what you really are. Shadow yawned, showing those unnervingly sharp teeth again. I went through the motions of my bedtime routine, hyper-aware of Shadow's presence. I changed into pajamas, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed. But instead of turning off the light, I grabbed a book from my nightstand and pretended to read. Hours passed. My eyes grew heavy, my body screaming for real rest, but I forced myself to stay awake, watching Shadow from the corner of my eye. Just as I was about to give up, convinced I was truly losing my mind, it happened. Shadow, who had been curled up at the foot of the bed, stood and stretched. But the stretch didn't stop. His body began to elongate, fur receding, limbs lengthening. I watched, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and fascination, as the cat I had taken and transformed into the tall, dark figure that had been haunting me for weeks. A scream caught in my throat as the figure turned towards me, yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. I scrambled backwards, tangling myself in the sheets. What are you? I managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head, an eerily familiar gesture. When it spoke, its voice was deep and resonant, with an accent I couldn't place. I am what you humans would call a shapeshifter, it said, though that term is a gross oversimplification of what I truly am. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Why me? Why have you been stalking me? The creature, I couldn't think of it as Shadow anymore, took a step closer. I pressed myself against the headboard, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I wasn't stalking you, Eason, it said, my name sounding strange in his otherworldly voice. I was observing, learning. You humans are fascinating creatures. But why me? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. The shapeshifter's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. Because you were kind, because you were lonely, because you needed something to believe in beyond your mundane existence. I shook my head, trying to clear it. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I don't understand, I said. The creature sighed, a surprisingly human sound. No, I suppose you wouldn't. Your kind rarely does. But perhaps I can show you. It extended a hand towards me, long fingers ending in sharp, claw-like nails. I stared at it, my body trembling. What will happen if I take your hand? Asked. You'll see the world as I see it, the shapeshifter replied. You'll understand truths that your human mind can barely comprehend. You'll be more. I hesitated, my hand hovering inches from the creature's. Everything in me screamed that this was dangerous, that I should run, call the police, do anything but accept this impossible offer. But another part of me, a part one barely recognized, was curious, excited even. This was beyond anything I had ever experienced, beyond anything I had ever dreamed possible. Will it hurt? I asked, indicating how small my voice sounded. The shapeshifter's yellow eyes softened slightly. Change always hurts, Ethan. But I promise you, it will be worth it. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then, before I could change my mind, I grasped the creature's hand. The world exploded into light and sound. I felt my body stretching, changing, becoming something other. I saw glimpses of realities beyond my own, heard whispers in languages no human tongue could pronounce. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I found myself back in my bedroom, gasping for breath. But everything was different, sharper, more vibrant. I could hear the heartbeats of the mice in the walls, smell the lingering scent of my neighbor's dinner from hours ago. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see fur or claws, but they looked the same as always. And yet, I knew I was fundamentally changed. The shapeshifter, I couldn't think of a better name for it, stood watching me, its expression unreadable. What happens now? I asked, my voice hoarse. Now, it said, you learn, you grow, you become more than you ever thought possible. As dawn broke outside my window, casting long shadows across my bedroom, I realized that my life had irrevocably changed. The lonely librarian was gone, replaced by something more. I stood on shaky legs, moving to the window. The city spread out before me, familiar and yet utterly new. I could see the ebb and flow of energy, the hidden currents that connected all living things. I don't know if I'm ready for this, I said softly. The shapeshifter moved to stand beside me, its presence no longer terrifying but comforting. No one ever is, it replied, but you will adapt. You will thrive. As the sun rose on a new day, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The world I had known was gone, replaced by something far more vast and wondrous than I could have ever imagined. And as I stood there, the shapeshifter by my side, I felt a thrill of excitement. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them. The lonely librarian was gone. In his place stood a being on the cusp of understanding truths beyond human comprehension. And as I took my first steps into this new reality, I couldn't help but smile. The adventure, it seemed, was just beginning. The world had shifted on its axis, and I was struggling to find my footing. The revelation that Shadow was a shapeshifter, and that I had somehow been changed by our encounter, left me reeling. I stumbled through the next few days in a daze, calling in sick to work and barely leaving my apartment. On the third day, as I stood staring blankly into my refrigerator, a sharp knock at the door jolted me back to reality. I froze, my heart racing. Who could it be? Had someone noticed the strange occurrences? Were they coming for me? Ethan? The Sarah. Are you in there? I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Just Sarah. Normal, human Sarah. I glanced at Shadow, who was perched on the kitchen counter, watching me with those unervingly intelligent eyes. Stay, I whispered, pointing at him. Then, louder, coming. I opened the door to find Sarah standing there, concern etched on her face. Tay, she said, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. You muck rough. Are you okay? I forced a smile, acutely aware of how I must appear, unshaven. Here, miss, wearing the same clothes I'd had on for days. Yeah, just a bad flu. I'm feeling better, though. Should be back at work soon. Sarah didn't look convinced. Ethan, I'm worried about you. You've been acting strange for weeks, and now this. Are you sure there isn't something else going on? For a wild moment, I considered telling her everything. About Shadow, about the transformation, about the new world I was only beginning to understand. But how could I explain it without sounding completely insane? I'm fine, really? I insisted, plastering on what I hoped was a reassuring smile. Just needed some time to rest and recover. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but if you need anything at all, please call me. Promise. I promise, I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. As I closed the door behind her, I leaned against it, closing my eyes. The guilt of deceiving Sarah, one of the few people who genuinely seemed to care about me, sat heavy in my chest. You can't tell her, you know, a deep voice said from behind me. I whirled around to find the shapeshifter, no longer in cat form, standing in my living room. Even after days of this, the sight still sent a jolt of fear and awe through me. I know, I replied, running a hand through my tangled hair. But I hate lying to her. The shapeshifter tilted its head, an eerily familiar gesture. Lies are sometimes necessary to protect those we care about. Your world isn't ready for the truth of what exists beyond its narrow understanding. I sighed, moving to collapse onto the couch. So what now? I can't just Go back to my old life. Not after everything that's happened. The shapeshifter's yellow eyes seemed to glow in the dim light of the apartment. Now, Ethan, the hunt begins. I sat up straighter, a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through me. The hunt? What do you mean? You've been given a gift, the creature said, its voice resonating with power. The ability to see beyond the veil that separates your world from others. But with that gift comes responsibility. There are things that slip through the cracks between realities. Dangerous things. It's our job to find them, to stop them from causing harm. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. And how exactly are we supposed to do that? The shapeshifter's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. We start with research. Your skills as a librarian will be more useful than you might think. And so began the strangest few days of my life. I returned to work, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, while secretly combing through every book on folklore, mythology, and the occult that I could get my hands on. The shapeshifter, once again in cat form, accompanied me, drawing curious looks from my coworkers. I didn't know you had a cat, Ethan, Sarah said one afternoon, reaching down to pet Shadow. I tensed, but the shapeshifter just purred, playing its role perfectly. Oh yeah, I said, trying to sound casual. Recent addition. Helps with my anxiety. Sarah smiled, scratching Shadow behind the ears. Well, he's adorable, and I'm glad you're feeling better. As she walked away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Shadow looked up at me, and I could have sworn I saw amusement in those yellow eyes. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I muttered under my breath. That night, back in my apartment, I spread out my notes on the coffee table. Books and printouts covered every available surface. A chaotic map of myths and legends from around the world. Okay, I said, running a hand through my hair. I've got information on everything from skinwalkers to kitsune to jinn. But how do we know what we're actually looking for? The shapeshifter, back in its humanoid form, stood by the window, gazing out at the city. You'll know, it said cryptically. The gift I've given you, it's more than just enhanced senses. You'll be able to feel when something isn't right, when something doesn't belong in this reality. I sighed in frustration. That's not very helpful. Can't you just, I don't know, point me in the right direction? The creature turned to face me, its expression unreadable. This isn't a game, Ethan. It's not something I can simply hand to you. You need to learn to grow into your new abilities. The hunt is as much about discovering yourself as it is about finding these entities. I was about to argue further when suddenly, I felt it. A chill ran down my spine, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It was like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious symphony. Something was wrong. You feel it, don't you? The shapeshifter said, its voice low and intense. I nodded, unable to speak. The sensation was overwhelming. A mixture of fear and exhilaration unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Then let's go, the creature said, moving towards the door. Go? Do where? I asked, scrambling to grab my jacket. The shapeshifter paused, looking back at me with those glowing yellow eyes. To hunt. We moved through the night-shrouded streets of Chicago, the shapeshifter leading the way. I followed, my senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger. Every unexpected sound made me jump. As we neared the lakefront, the feeling of wrongness intensified. I could almost taste it in the air, a metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. There, I whispered, pointing towards a small park. A figure stood beneath the streetlight, its form flickering and shifting in a way that defied natural explanation. The shapeshifter nodded approvingly. Good. You're learning quickly. Now we approach carefully. Remember what I taught you. Part pounding, I followed the creature's lead. We moved silently through the shadows, drawing closer to the entity that didn't belong in our world. As we neared, I could see it more clearly. It looked almost human, but its proportions were off. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and its eyes, when it turned to look at us, were solid black. "What is it?" I whispered, fear threatening to overwhelm me. "A wraith," the shapeshifter replied, its voice barely audible. "A being of pure energy, feeding on the life force of humans. We need to send it back to its own realm before it can cause any more harm." I swallowed hard, trying to remember everything I'd read over the past few days. "How do we do that?" The shapeshifter turned to me, its yellow eyes blazing with an otherworldly light. "We use the gift I gave you. Focus, Ethan. Feel the energy around you, the connections between all living things. The wraith is a disruption in that energy. You can push it back through the veil." I closed my eyes, concentrating. At first, I felt nothing but my own fear and doubt. But then, slowly, I began to sense it, the web of energy that connected everything. And there, like a tear in fabric, was the wraith. Without thinking, I reached out with my mind, pushing against the anomaly. The wraith screeched, a sound that set my teeth on edge. It lashed out, spectral tendrils whipping through the air. "Keep going," the shapeshifter urged. "You're doing it." I gritted my teeth, pushing harder. The world around me seemed to fade away, leaving nothing but the struggle between me and this otherworldly entity. With a final, desperate push, I felt something give way. The wraith let out one last, unearthly wail, and then it was gone. The tear in reality closed, leaving behind nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The shapeshifter knelt beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Well done, Ethan," it said, and I could hear a note of pride in its voice. "Your first hunt, and you've already banished a wraith. You're a natural." I looked up, a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration coursing through me. "That was intense. Is it always like that?" The creature helped me to my feet, its yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Every hunt is different, but yes, it's always intense. This is the reality you've stepped into, Ethan. A world of wonders and terrors beyond human imagination." As we made our way back to my apartment, I felt changed. The lonely librarian was gone, replaced by something more. A hunter, a protector, someone who could see the truth of the world and act to defend it. The hunt had begun, and I knew that my life would never be the same again. But as I walked through the night-shrouded streets of Chicago, the shapeshifter by my side, I felt a thrill of excitement. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them. The adventure, it seemed, was just beginning. The weeks following my first hunt blurred together in a whirlwind of research, training, and increasingly dangerous encounters with otherworldly entities. By day, I maintained my facade as a mild-mannered librarian. By night, I delved deeper into the hidden world that existed alongside our own, guided by the shapeshifter I had once known as Shadow. But as my power grew, so did my unease. The constant secrecy, the weight of responsibility, the gnawing fear that one day I might not be strong enough to face what came through the veil. It was all taking its toll. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when things came to a head. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by ancient tomes and hastily scribbled notes, my head pounding from hours of intense study. "There has to be a way to close the rifts permanently," I muttered, more to myself than to the shapeshifter lounging in cat form on the windowsill. "We can't keep doing this forever. It's not sustainable." The cat's form shimmered, elongating into the now familiar humanoid figure. Yellow eyes regarded me with a mixture of concern and something that might have been pity. "Ethan," the creature said, its voice resonating with otherworldly power, You're pushing yourself too hard. These things take time, centuries, even. You can't expect to master them in a matter of weeks. I slammed my hand on the table, frustration boiling over. We don't have centuries. Every night, more of these things slip through. People are getting hurt, even if they don't realize it. There has to be a way to stop it for good. The shapeshifter was silent for a long moment, its gaze intense. Finally, it spoke, each word measured and careful. There is a ritual, an ancient and dangerous one. It's said to have the power to seal the rifts between realities. I sat up straighter, hope surging through me. Why didn't you tell me about this before? We could have dashed. Because it's incredibly risky. The creature cut me off, its tone sharp. The power required. It's not something to be trifled with. Many have tried and failed, often with catastrophic consequences. I stood, pacing the small confines of my apartment. But it could work, right? If we did it correctly. The shapeshifter's yellow eyes followed my movement. Theoretically, yes. But Ethan, you must understand the gravity of what you're suggesting. This isn't like banishing a single entity. This ritual, if done wrong, could tear apart the very fabric of reality. I stopped pacing, turning to face the creature. Then teach me. Show me how to do it right. Please. For a moment, I thought the shapeshifter would refuse. But then it nodded, a look of resignation passing over its inhuman features. Very well. But remember, I warned you of the dangers. The next few days were a blur of intense preparation. We gathered rare herbs and crystals, drew complex diagrams on my apartment floor, and rehearsed the intricate series of gestures and incantations required for the ritual. A sense of foreboding grew in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the potential reward. An end to the constant battles. A chance to truly protect the world I had sworn to defend. Finally, on a moonless night, we were ready. I stood in the center of the ritual circle, my heart pounding. The shapeshifter stood just outside, its yellow eyes glowing in the candlelight. Are you sure about this, Ethan? It asked one last time. Once we begin, there's no turning back. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I'm sure. Let's do this. With trembling hands, I began the ritual. Words and languages long forgotten spilled from my lips as I moved through the complex series of gestures we had practiced. The air in the apartment grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. As I neared the climax of the ritual, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The candles flickered, their flames growing taller, casting wild shadows on the walls. A wind that shouldn't have been possible indoors whipped around me, tugging at my clothes and hair. Ethan? The shapeshifter's voice cut through the howling wind. Something's wrong. The energies are dash, but it was too late. I was too far into the ritual to stop. Power surged through me, more intense than anything I had ever experienced. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I shouted the final words of the incantation, my voice barely audible over the roar of otherworldly energies. For a moment, everything went still. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, a blinding light erupted from the center of the ritual circle. I screamed, the light searing my eyes, the power threatening to tear me apart. I felt the shapeshifter's presence nearby, its own energy intertwining with the chaotic forces swirling around us. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the wind died down, and I found myself on my hands and knees, gasping for breath. Did it work? I managed to choke out, blinking spots from my vision. But as my sight cleared, my blood ran cold. This wasn't my apartment. The walls were twisted and warped, shadows moving of their own accord. The air felt thick and oppressive, carrying scents that were alien and wrong. Oh, Ethan, The shapeshifter's voice came from behind me, heavy with sorrow. "What have you done?" I turned to face the creature, fear clawing at my throat. "Where are we? What happened?" The shapeshifter's form seemed to flicker and shift, as if struggling to maintain its shape in this strange environment. The ritual, it didn't close the rifts, tore open a new one. We've been pulled into a realm between realities, a place not meant for beings like us. Horror washed over me as the full implications of what had happened sank in. Can we go back? Reverse it somehow. The creature's yellow eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of something I had never seen there before. Fear. "I don't know, Easton. This place, it's unlike anything I've encountered before. The roles here are different." As if to emphasize its point, a section of what might have been a wall suddenly liquefied, flowing like water before resolidifying in a new, impossible configuration. In the distance, I heard sounds that no earthly creature could have made. "What do we do now?" I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. The shapeshifter moved closer, its presence oddly comforting in this nightmarish realm. "We survive, we learn, and we try to find a way back. But Ethan, you must understand, time moves differently here. What feels like hours to us might be days, weeks, or even years in our own reality." The weight of what I had done crashed down on me. In my arrogance, my impatience to solve everything at once, I had not only failed to close the rifts but had trapped myself and the shapeshifter in a realm of nightmares. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "This is all my fault. I should have listened to you." The creature placed a hand on my shoulder, its touch grounding me in this shifting, uncertain world. "What's done is done. Regret will not help us now. We must focus on survival and finding a way home." I nodded, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. As I looked around at the twisted landscape that surrounded us, I felt a resolve hardening within me. I had gotten us into this mess, and I would find a way to get us out. "Where do we start?" I asked, pushing myself to my feet. The shapeshifter's form shimmered, settling into something more suited to this strange environment. Part feline, part humanoid, wholly alien. "We explore, we learn the rules of this place, and we stay together. This realm is dangerous, Ethan. More dangerous than anything you've faced before." As if in response to its words, a piercing shriek echoed in the distance. I tensed, my newly enhanced senses screaming danger. "What was that?" I whispered, scanning the shifting landscape. "Our first challenge, I suspect," the shapeshifter replied, its voice grim. "Remember your training, Ethan. Everything you've learned will be put to the test here." I swallowed hard, fear and determination warring within me. The lonely librarian I had once been seemed like a distant memory now. In his place stood a being caught between worlds, facing challenges beyond human comprehension. As we set off into the nightmare realm, the shapeshifter a comforting presence at my side, I couldn't help but wonder, would I ever see my own world again? And if I did, how changed would I be by this experience? The failed ritual had set us on a path I could never have imagined. But as we ventured deeper into this twisted reality, I made a silent vow. I would find a way back. I would fix what I had broken, and I would never again underestimate the powers I was dealing with. The hunt had taken an unexpected turn, but it was far from over. In fact, I realized with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, it had only just begun. Time lost all meaning in this twisted dimension. What felt like days might have been mere hours, or perhaps centuries had passed in the blink of an eye. The landscape around us shifted constantly, defying all laws of physics and reason. Mountains of writhing flesh would erupt from the ground, only to melt away into seas of liquid light. The sky, if it could be called that, pulsed with colors that had no names in any human language. I stumbled forward, my mind struggling to process the ever-changing environment. The shapeshifter moved beside me, its form fluid and adaptable in this realm of chaos. How long have we been here? I gasped, my voice hoarse from disuse. The creature turned its yellow eyes towards me, their glow seeming to pierce through the swirling mists that surrounded us. Time has no meaning here, Ethan. We must focus on survival, on finding a way back. Nothing else matters. As if to emphasize its point, a chasm suddenly opened beneath our feet. I let out a strangled cry as we plummeted into darkness, only to land softly on a surface that felt like living moss. The walls around us pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence, casting everything in a sickly green glow. "This place?" I muttered, running a hand through my tangled hair. "It's alive, isn't it? All of it." The shapeshifter nodded, its form rippling like water. "In a sense, this realm exists at the intersection of countless realities. What we perceive is merely our mind's attempt to make sense of the incomprehensible." A sound echoed through the organic corridor we found ourselves in, a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was laughter, but not any laughter I had ever heard before. It was the mirth of something ancient and utterly alien. "We're not alone here," I whispered, my heart racing. "We never were," the shapeshifter replied grimly. "Call me. We must keep moving." We pressed on through the ever-shifting landscape. At times, we walked through forests of crystalline trees that sang mournful melodies, as wind that wasn't wind brushed against their branches. Other times, we found ourselves wading through seas of memories, fragments of lives lived and unlived swirling around us like schools of fish. Throughout it all, I caught glimpses of other beings, creatures that defied description, entities of pure energy, things that seemed to exist in more dimensions than I could perceive. Some ignored us, while others watched with unsettling interest. "Why aren't they attacking us?" I asked during a rare moment of relative calm. We had found ourselves in a pocket of stability, a small clearing in what appeared to be a forest of wind chimes, each one crafted from bones of unknown origin. The shapeshifter's form solidified slightly, taking on a more humanoid appearance. Many of them don't perceive us as we perceive them. To some, we might be little more than fleeting thoughts. To others, we could be gods. It's best not to draw unnecessary attention. As if summoned by its words, a figure emerged from between the chiming bone structures. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong, limbs too long, joints bending in impossible ways. Its face, if it can be called that, was a swirling vortex of features that never quite settled into a recognizable form. "WL come," it said, its voice an unsettling chorus of tones. New ones. Lost found lost. Guess no maybe. I stepped back, my body tensing for a fight, but the shapeshifter placed a restraining hand on my arm. "We seek passage," it said, its voice taking on a resonance I had never heard before. "We do not belong in this realm." The entity tilted its ever-shifting head. Belong. All none some belong. Passage blockage flow. Price gift sacrifice." I looked at the shapeshifter, confusion and fear warring within me. "What is it saying? Can it help us?" "It's offering to guide us," the creature replied, its yellow eyes never leaving the entity. "But there will be a cost. There always is." The vortex faced being stretched out a hand, or perhaps it was a tentacle or a beam of light. It was hard to tell in this place where reality was so fluid. Choice, it intoned. "Follow, lead, lose. Decide, commit, regret." I swallowed hard, looking to the shapeshifter for guidance. But I knew deep down that this was my decision to make. I had gotten us into this mess with my arrogance and impatience. It was up to me to get us out. "We'll follow you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But know this, we're not prey, and we're not powerless. Try to deceive us, and you'll regret it. The entity's face vortex spun faster for a moment, and I could have sworn I heard amusement in its discordant voice. Brave foolish wise, come follow lead. As we set off after our strange guide, the landscape around us began to shift more rapidly than ever before. We walked through memories that weren't our own, experienced lifetimes in the span of heartbeats, and witnessed the birth and death of entire universes. Through it all, I clung to my sense of self, terrified of losing who I was in the sea of infinite possibilities. The shapeshifter remained a constant presence at my side, its familiar energy anchoring me to reality, or what passed for reality in this place. How much further? I gasped after what felt like eons of travel. My mind was reeling, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of everything I had seen and experienced. Our guide, which had been leading us through a canyon formed from the crystallized dreams of long-dead gods, paused. Clothes far everywhere, it said cryptically. Last first only test remains. Before I could ask what it meant, the ground beneath our feet vanished. We fell through layers of reality, each one stranger than the last. I saw versions of myself, lives I could have lived, choices I could have made. I saw the shapeshifter in countless forms, some beautiful, some terrifying. And then, with a jolt that knocked the breath from my lungs, we landed. I found myself standing in my apartment. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, down to the coffee mug I had left on the counter the night of the failed ritual. What is this? I asked, my voice shaking. The shapeshifter, now in its familiar cat form, padded across the floor. A test, I believe, or perhaps a trap. Be on your guard, Ethan. Our guide was nowhere to be seen, but its voice echoed around us. Choice, choice, choice. Stay, go, become. Truth lies reality. I moved through the apartment, every detail perfect and familiar. Felt so real, so normal after the chaos we had been through. Part of me wanted nothing more than to collapse onto my couch, to pretend that everything had been a strange dream. But as I neared the front door, I hesitated. This isn't real, is it? It's just another illusion. The shapeshifter's yellow eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. You're learning, Easton, but the question remains, what will you do with that knowledge? I stood there, hand on the doorknob, torn between the comfort of the familiar and the truth of our situation. It would be so easy to stay, to lose myself in this perfect replica of my old life. But that life was gone. I had changed, grown, experienced things beyond human comprehension. There was no going back, not really. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and opened the door. Instead of my hallway, I saw a swirling vortex of energy, a rift between realities. Well done, the shapeshifter said, moving to stand beside me. You've passed the test. The way home is open to us. But as we stood on the threshold between worlds, a terrible realization dawned on me. Wait, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. How do we know this is really the way back? What if it's just another trick, another layer of illusion? The shapeshifter was silent for a long moment, its form flickering between cat and humanoid. We don't know, it admitted finally. In this realm, certainty is a luxury we cannot afford. We can only trust our instincts and hope. I looked out into the swirling chaos beyond my apartment door, fear and excitement warring within me. And if we're wrong, if this leads us even further from home, then we face whatever comes together, the creature replied, its voice filled with a warmth I had never heard before. You've grown strong, Ethan. Whatever lies beyond that portal, I believe you're ready to face it. I nodded, squaring my shoulders. The lonely librarian I had once been was gone, replaced by someone or something new. Someone who had walked between worlds and faced the incomprehensible. Together, then, I said, reaching out to place a hand on the shapeshifter's shoulder. As one, we stepped through the portal, leaving the false comfort of my apartment behind. The vortex of energy engulfed us, tearing us apart and putting us back together in ways I couldn't begin to understand. And through it all, one thought burned in my mind. Whatever waited for us on the other side, I was ready to face it. The nightmare realm had changed me, tested me, nearly broken me, but I had survived. I had learned. As we hurtled through the space between realities, I closed my eyes and embraced the uncertainty. The hunt, it seemed, was far from over, but for the first time since this all began, I felt truly prepared for whatever came next. The nightmare realm faded behind us, but its lessons and its horrors would stay with me forever. Whatever reality we emerged into, I knew I would never be the same, and somehow that thought didn't scare me anymore. It excited me. The vortex spat us out onto cold, hard ground. I gasped, filling my lungs with air that tasted blessedly normal after the alien atmospheres of the nightmare realm. Slowly, I opened my eyes, half afraid of what I might see. We were in an alley, a perfectly ordinary, slightly grimy Chicago alley. The brick walls, the overflowing dumpsters, the distant sound of traffic. It was all achingly familiar. "Are we back?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The shapeshifter, once again in its cat form, headed around the alley, sniffing cautiously. "It appears so," it said. "But appearances can be deceiving, as we've learned." I pushed myself to my feet, my body aching in ways I couldn't quite describe. How long had we been gone? Days? Weeks? Years? I patted my pockets, relieved to find my wallet and phone still there. The screen lit up when I pressed the power button, and I felt a jolt of shock. 3 days, I whispered. "We've only been gone 3 days." The shapeshifter's yellow eyes met mine. Time moves differently between realities. What felt like an eternity to us was merely a long weekend here. I leaned against the alley wall, suddenly overwhelmed. We were back, but nothing felt the same. I closed my eyes, and fragmented visions from the nightmare realm flashed through my mind. Impossible landscapes, alien entities, the constant shifting of reality itself. How do we just go back? I asked, opening my eyes to look at the shapeshifter. After everything we've seen, everything we've been through, how do we return to normal life? The cat's form shimmered, elongating into its more humanoid shape. "We don't," it said simply. "You've been changed, Ethan. There's no going back to who you were before. But that doesn't mean you can't move forward." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a barrage of notifications. Missed calls from work, concerned text messages from Sarah, even an email from my landlord asking if everything was okay. "They're worried about you," the shapeshifter observed. "Your disappearance didn't go unnoticed." I scrolled through the messages, a knot forming in my stomach. What do I tell them? How do I explain where I've been? The creature placed a hand on my shoulder, its touch grounding me in reality. "You tell them as much of the truth as you can without revealing what they're not ready to know. You were ill, overwhelmed, needed time to yourself. It's not a lie, not really." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "And what about all of this?" I gestured vaguely, encompassing the shapeshifter, our experiences, the knowledge we'd gained. "Do we just pretend it never happened?" The shapeshifter's yellow eyes seemed to glow in the dim light of the alley. "No, we use what we've learned. Our journey through the nightmare realm wasn't just a trial, Ethan. It was an education." As we made our way back to my apartment, the shapeshifter once again in its cat form, I tried to process everything that had happened. The sights, sounds, and sensations of the nightmare realm were still vivid in my mind, but they were beginning to take on a dreamlike quality. If it weren't for the constant presence of the shapeshifter, I might have been tempted to believe it had all been some sort of hallucination. My apartment was exactly as we'd left it, the failed ritual circle still etched on the floor. I collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion suddenly hitting me like a physical force. "Rest," the shapeshifter said, jumping up beside me. "Your mind and body need time to adjust. We'll talk more when you've recovered." I wanted to argue, to demand answers and explanations, but my eyelids were already growing heavy. As I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard whispers in languages no human tongue could pronounce. When I awoke, sunlight was streaming through my windows. For a moment, I was disoriented, half expecting to see the shifting landscapes of the nightmare realm. But no, this was my apartment, solid and real. The shapeshifter was perched on the windowsill, watching me with those unblinking yellow eyes. "How do you feel?" it asked. I sat up, running a hand through my tangled hair. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I admitted. "But also different, clearer somehow." The creature nodded. "The experiences you've had have expanded your consciousness. You're perceiving reality in ways you couldn't before." As if to prove its point, I suddenly became aware of everything. The subtle vibrations of the building, the ebb and flow of energy from the city outside, even the faint echoes of realities brushing against our own. It was overwhelming, and I gasped, clutching my head. "Easy," the shapeshifter said, moving to my side. "It will take time to adjust, but this awareness is crucial for what comes next." I looked up, meeting its gaze. "What does come next?" The creature's form shimmered, settling into its more humanoid shape. "Now we truly begin to understand our enemy, the beings that slip through the cracks between realities. We need to learn why they come, what they want." "I thought we knew that," I said, frowning. "They feed on humans, on our world. Isn't that enough?" The shapeshifter shook its hand. "That's a simplification. These entities, they're not just predators. They're refugees, explorers, sometimes even lost souls. Some are malevolent, yes, but others are simply trying to survive in a reality not their own." I stood, pacing the small confines of my living room. "So what, we're supposed to feel sorry for them? After everything we've seen, everything they've done?" "Not sorry," the creature replied. "Understanding. Only by truly comprehending these beings can we hope to deal with them effectively. And to do that, we need to go to the source." I stopped pacing, a chill running down my spine. "The source? You mean?" The shapeshifter nodded, its yellow eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "We need to find the points where realities intersect, the places where the veil between worlds is thinnest. And we need to study them, to learn the patterns of how and why these entities cross over." The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Part of me wanted nothing more than to retreat into the safety of my old life, to pretend that none of this had ever happened. But I knew that was impossible. I had seen too much, learned too much to ever go back. "Where do we start?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The shapeshifter moved to the center of the room, its form rippling like water. "Close your eyes," it instructed. "Focus on the energy around you, the currents of reality that you can now perceive. What do you feel?" I did as it said, closing my eyes and reaching out with senses I was only beginning to understand. And first, there was nothing but the usual background noise of the city. But then, slowly, I began to sense something else. A vibration, a resonance that didn't quite fit with the rest of reality. "There's something," I said, my brow furrowing in concentration. "To the north. Feels like a tear, a weak point." "Could," the shapeshifter said, and I could hear approval in its voice. "That's our first destination. But before we go, there's something you need to understand, Ethan." I opened my eyes, meeting its gaze. "What's that?" The creature's expression was solemn. "The more we delve into these mysteries, the more we risk attracting attention. not just from the entities we're studying, but from forces far beyond your current comprehension. Are you prepared for that? I thought about everything we'd been through, everything I'd seen and experienced. The lonely librarian I had once been seemed like a distant memory now. In his place stood someone, or something new, someone who had walked between worlds and faced the incomprehensible. "I'm ready," I said, surprised by the conviction in my voice. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The shapeshifter nodded, a flicker of what might have been pride crossing its inhuman features. "Then let's begin. The hunt for understanding starts now." As we prepared to leave, gathering supplies and steeling ourselves for whatever we might encounter, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The world I had known was gone, replaced by something far vaster and more wondrous than I could have ever imagined. And as we stepped out into the Chicago night, the shapeshifter by my side, I knew that our journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The true nature of reality, the secrets of the entities that moved between worlds, it was all out there, waiting to be discovered. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers we might face, I was ready. The nightmare realm had changed me, tested me, nearly broken me, but I had survived. I had learned, and now I was prepared to uncover truths that would shake the very foundations of reality itself. The hunt for understanding had begun, and I intended to see it through to the end, no matter where it might lead us. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy as we approached the weak point in reality. It was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, its dilapidated exterior belying the cosmic significance of what lay within. My newly enhanced senses could perceive the subtle distortions in the fabric of space-time, rippling outward like waves on a pond. "Are you ready?" the shapeshifter asked, its form flickering between human and feline as if unsure which was more appropriate for the situation. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. As ready as I'll ever be. We entered the warehouse cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the beams of moonlight that filtered through broken windows, giving the scene an eerily ethereal quality. But it wasn't the abandoned machinery or the graffiti-covered walls that held my attention. It was the shimmering tear in reality that hovered in the center of the room, pulsing with an energy that made my teeth ache. What is it?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. The shapeshifter's yellow eyes glowed in the dim light. "A gateway," he replied, its voice resonating with power. "A bridge between our world and others." As we drew closer, I could see flashes of other realities through the tear, impossible landscapes, alien skies, beings that defied description. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "How do we close it?" I asked, tearing my gaze away from the hypnotic visions. The shapeshifter shook its hand. "Closing it isn't the goal, Ethan. We're here to understand it, to learn its rhythms and patterns. Only then can we hope to manage the flow of entities between worlds." I nodded, trying to focus on the task at hand rather than the mind-bending implications of what we were seeing. We set up our equipment, a bizarre mix of scientific instruments and occult paraphernalia that we had cobbled together over the past few weeks. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by anything in our reality, but by entities on the other side of the rift, curious about the beings studying their gateway. Hours passed as we took readings, recorded observations, and attempted to decipher the complex energies swirling around us. The shapeshifter moved with purpose, its knowledge of cosmic forces far surpassing my own. I did my best to keep up, my mind expanding to accommodate concepts that would have been incomprehensible to me just months ago. It was nearing dawn when something changed. The rift pulsed, its energy spiking in a way that set every nerve in my body on edge. "Something's coming through," the shapeshifter warned, its form tensing. I braced myself, ready for battle. But what emerged from the rift wasn't the monstrous entity I had expected. It was me, or rather a version of me. This Ethan was older, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with years I hadn't yet lived. But it was his eyes that truly shocked me. They glowed with the same otherworldly light as the shapeshifters. To know, Ethan, my older self said, his voice carrying echoes of realities I couldn't begin to comprehend. We've been waiting for you. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What, how, who's we? The other Ethan smiled, a sad, knowing expression. The Watchers, the guardians of the spaces between realities. We've been observing you, guiding you, preparing you for this moment. I turned to the shapeshifter, confusion and betrayal warring within me. Did you know about this? Have you been manipulating me this whole time? The creature's form rippled, uncertainty clear in its yellow eyes. Not exactly. I knew you had a greater destiny, but the specifics were hidden even from me. The older Ethan stepped forward, his movements fluid and unnatural. There was no other way. The path you've walked, the trials you've faced, they were all necessary to prepare you for what comes next. And what exactly is that? I demanded, anger rising to replace my shock. My older self gestured to the rift behind him. The multiverse is in crisis, Ethan. The boundaries between realities are weakening. Allowing things through that should never cross over. We need guardians, beings who can walk between worlds and maintain the cosmic balance. I shook my head, overwhelmed by the implications. And you think I'm supposed to be one of these guardians? I'm just a librarian. I'm not you. Not yet, the other Ethan said softly. But you will be. The choice lies before you now. Embrace your destiny. Join us in our eternal vigil. Or turn away and let the multiverse fall into chaos. The shapeshifter moved to my side, its presence oddly comforting in the face of this cosmic revelation. The choice must be yours, Ethan, but know that whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. I closed my eyes, my mind racing. Images flashed through my consciousness. The lonely librarian I had once been. The adventures I'd had since meeting the shapeshifter. The wonders and horrors I'd witnessed in the nightmare realm. And now, this a destiny beyond anything I could have imagined. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the warehouse around us had begun to fade, reality itself seeming to warp and shift. The rift pulsed, growing larger, its energies intertwining with the very fabric of space-time. What's happening? I asked, my voice barely audible over the rising hum of cosmic forces. The moment of choice, my older self replied. The convergence of possibilities. Whatever you decide here will ripple across realities, shaping the fate of the multiverse. I looked to the shapeshifter, seeking guidance, reassurance, anything. But for once, the creature seemed as lost as I was, its form flickering rapidly between shapes as if struggling to maintain coherence in this liminal space. I don't know if I'm ready for this, I admitted, fear and exhilaration warring within me. The other Ethan smiled, a hint of his former self shining through the cosmic being he had become. None of us ever are, but that's what makes us human, even as we become something more. The rift pulsed again, and I felt a pull, an indescribable urge to step forward and embrace the unknown. But something held me back, a final, nagging doubt. If I do this, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. If I become you, what happens to who I am now, to the people I care about, the life I've built? My older self's expression softened. They'll be safe, protected by the very balance you'll help maintain. And a part of you will always remember, always cherish the connections you've made. They're what keep us anchored, what remind us of why we do this. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of countless realities pressing down on me. This was it, the moment that would define not just my life, but the fate of existence itself. With a final look at the shapeshifter, my faithful companion through this impossible journey, I made my decision. I stepped forward, towards my older self, towards the pulsing rift that promised both wonder and terror. "I'm ready," I said, surprised by the conviction in my voice. The other Ethan nodded, pride and sorrow mingling in his otherworldly eyes. He reached out, and as our hands touched, I felt a surge of cosmic energy unlike anything I had ever experienced. Memories that weren't mine, or weren't mine yet, flooded my consciousness. I saw countless worlds, infinite possibilities, the intricate dance of realities that made up the multiverse, and I saw my role in it all, the eternal vigil that awaited me. As the energy built to a crescendo, I turned back one last time. The shapeshifter stood watching, its form now a swirling vortex of potential, as if finally revealing its true nature. "Thank you," I said, my voice echoing across realities. "For everything." The creature nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed more emotion than any words could have. And then, with a final pulse of energy that shook the foundations of reality itself, everything changed. I felt my consciousness expand, merging with my older self, becoming something far beyond what I had been. The rift enveloped us, and I saw the multiverse in all its infinite glory. In that moment of transcendence, I understood. The lonely librarian, the reluctant hero, the cosmic guardian, they were all me, all part of the eternal cycle of growth and change that drove the multiverse forward. As my new awareness settled, I found myself standing in a place beyond places, a nexus point between realities. The other watchers were there, beings of incomprehensible power and knowledge, welcoming me to their ranks. But even as I embraced this new existence, I felt a tug, a connection to the world I had left behind. I knew then that a part of me would always be Ethan the librarian, Ethan the seeker of knowledge, and that connection, that humanity, would be my strength in the cosmic battles to come. The shapeshifter appeared beside me, its form now as fluid and cosmic as my own. "The hunt never truly ends," it said, its voice resonating across dimensions. "It merely changes." I nodded, understanding at last. This wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. The greatest adventure of all, the eternal quest to maintain the balance of the multiverse. As we set out into the infinite expanse of realities, I carried with me the memories of my former life, the lessons I had learned, and the unshakable determination to protect the cosmic tapestry that bound all of existence together. The lonely librarian was gone, transformed into something far greater. But in becoming a guardian of realities, I had found a purpose beyond anything I could have imagined. And as we ventured into the unknown, I knew that the true journey was only just beginning. And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments. We would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one. Jessica's eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light filtering through her car's windshield. The clock on the dashboard read 11:43 p.m. She blinked, trying to remember how she'd gotten here. The last thing she recalled was studying for her psychology midterm in her dorm room. "Focus, Jess," she muttered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The road ahead twisted like a serpent, cutting through the dense Colorado forest. Tall pines loomed on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the moonlight. Jessica's heart raced as she navigated the sharp turns, her palms growing sweaty against the leather of the steering wheel. A sign flashed by, "Mountain pass ahead, drive carefully." Jessica swallowed hard. Something about this felt familiar yet terrifyingly wrong. She glanced at her phone in the cup holder, but the screen remained black. No signal. "Okay, just take it slow," she coached herself, easing her foot off the accelerator. The car responded, slowing from 50 to 40 miles per hour. As she rounded another bend, her headlights illuminated a deer standing in the middle of the road. Jessica gasped, instinctively jerking the wheel to the right. "No, no, no!" she cried out as the tires lost traction. The world spun around her, trees and stars blurring into a dizzying whirl. The screeching of tires filled her ears, drowning out her own screams. Jessica's stomach lurched with dread as she felt the car tilt, realizing too late that she'd swerved too close to the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as the car teetered on the precipice. For a split second, Jessica caught a glimpse of the vast darkness below, a yawning abyss ready to swallow her whole. Then, with a sickening lurch, the car plummeted over the edge. "Help!" Jessica screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Somebody help me!" But there was no one to hear her cries. The car tumbled down the rocky slope, each impact sending shockwaves of pain through Jessica's body. Glass shattered, metal crumpled, and Jessica felt herself being tossed around like a rag doll despite her seatbelt. In those eternal seconds of freefall, Jessica's mind raced. Images flashed before her eyes. Her parents' smiling faces, her little brother's laugh, the proud moment she got her acceptance letter to college. "I don't want to die," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. The car slammed into the ground with a thunderous crash. Jessica's head snapped forward, then back, her vision exploding with stars. The taste of copper filled her mouth as she bit her tongue. She could feel warm blood trickling down her face from a gash on her forehead. Dazed and in shock, Jessica blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The car had landed on its roof, and she hung upside down, suspended by her seatbelt. Every breath sent daggers of pain through her chest. Probably broken ribs, she thought distantly, remembering her first aid training. "Tilo?" she called out weakly. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." Only the creaking of settling metal answered her. Jessica tried to move, to unbuckle her seatbelt, but her arms wouldn't cooperate. A wave of nausea washed over her as the metallic scent of blood mixed with leaking gasoline. Gasoline. The realization hit her like a second impact. She needed to get out of the car now. "Come on, Jess," she urged herself, fighting against the pain and disorientation. "You have to move." With trembling fingers, she managed to press the seatbelt release. She crashed onto the roof of the car, crying out as fresh pain blossomed across her body. Gritting her teeth, Jessica began to drag herself towards the shattered driver's side window. Each movement was agony, glass and twisted metal cutting into her palms and knees. She could feel warm blood soaking through her jeans. Just as she reached the window, a new sound reached her ears. A low, ominous crackling. Jessica turned her head and her blood ran cold. Flames had erupted from the engine compartment, hungrily licking their way towards her. "No, please no," she sobbed, redoubling her efforts to escape. The heat grew intense, and smoke began to fill the car. Jessica coughed violently, her lungs burning as she struggled to breathe. The flames drew closer, their orange glow casting twisted shadows in the wreckage. With one final, desperate surge of strength, Jessica pulled herself through the window. Shards of glass tore at her skin, but she barely noticed, so focused was she on escape. She dragged herself a few feet from the car before collapsing, her body finally giving in to the trauma it had endured. Rolling onto her back, Jessica stared up at the star-filled sky. The crackling of the fire grew louder, and she could feel its heat on her skin. She wanted to move further away, but her body refused to respond. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I'm sorry, Dad. I love you." The fire roared, consuming the car. Jessica closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But instead of more pain, she felt a sudden, jarring shift. Her eyes snapped open, and she found herself gasping for air, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. Her dorm room came into focus. The gentle hum of her roommate's fan, the soft glow of the string lights they'd hung together, the familiar scent of her lavender air freshener. Jessica's hands flew to her body, expecting to find blood and broken bones. But there was nothing. It was just a dream, she panted, her heart still racing. Just a dream. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Jessica realized this was unlike any dream she'd ever had. The pain had felt real. The fear had been real. She could still taste blood in her mouth, still smell the acrid scent of smoke. A soft knock at her door made her jump. "Jess?" Her roommate's voice came through, thick with sleep. "Are you okay?" I heard screaming. Jessica opened her mouth to respond. But instead of words, a choked sob escaped her lips. The door creaked open, and her roommate, Emma, poked her head in. "Oh my God, Jess!" Emma gasped, rushing to her side. "What happened? You're shaking like a leaf." Jessica tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she collapsed into Emma's arms, violent sobs racking her body. "Sure, it's okay," Emma soothed, stroking Jessica's hair. "It was just a bad dream. You're safe now." But as Jessica clung to her friend, the vivid memories of the crash replaying in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a nightmare. Something had changed tonight, and deep in her gut, she knew with chilling certainty that her ordeal was far from over. It felt so real. She finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from screaming, "Emma." It felt so real. Emma pulled back, her brow furrowed with concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jessica shook her head, then winced as a phantom pain shot through her neck. Not right now. I just need a minute." "Okay," Emma said softly. "How about I make us some tea? That always helps me after a nightmare." Jessica nodded gratefully, and Emma squeezed her hand before leaving the room. Left alone, Jessica hugged her knees to her chest, trying to slow her breathing. She glanced at her phone. 3:17 a.m. In a few hours, she'd have to get up for class, face the world as if nothing had happened. But how could she, when every time she closed her eyes, she saw that winding mountain road, felt the sickening lurch as her car went over the edge? As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Jessica made a silent vow to herself. She would figure out what this dream meant, why it had felt so viscerally real, and she would do whatever it took to make sure she never had to experience that terror again. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would push her to the very limits of her sanity, blurring the lines between dream and reality in ways she could never have imagined. The shrill beeping of Jessica's alarm cut through the morning silence, jolting her awake. For a blissful moment, she forgot about the nightmare that had plagued her just hours ago. Then, like a tidal wave, the memories crashed over her. Jessica groaned, rubbing her eyes. The clock read 7:30 a.m. She'd managed to get a few hours of fitful sleep after Emma had comforted her, but she felt far from rested. "Come on, Jess," she muttered to herself. "It was just a dream. Get it together." She swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as her feet touched the cold floor. Every muscle in her body ached, as if she'd actually been in that car crash. Jessica shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. In the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face, avoiding her reflection in the mirror. She knew what she'd see: pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, the haunted look of someone who'd stared death in the face. "Stop it," she hissed at herself. It wasn't real. Back in her room, Jessica got dressed on autopilot, her mind still replaying scenes from the nightmare. The twisting mountain road, the deer, the sickening freefall. A knock at her door made her jump. "Jess," Emma's voice called out. "You up? I made coffee." Jessica took a deep breath, plastering what she hoped was a convincing smile on her face before opening the door. "Morning, Em," she said, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. Emma's brow furrowed with concern. "How are you feeling? You look like you barely slept." Jessica shrugged, following Emma to their small kitchenette. "I'm fine. Just a rough night, that's all." Emma handed her a steaming mug of coffee. "Do you want to talk about it?" That nightmare seemed pretty intense. For a moment, Jessica considered confiding in her friend. But how could she explain the visceral reality of the dream, the lingering certainty that it was more than just a product of her imagination? "It's okay," Jessica said, forcing a light tone. "Probably just stress from midterms coming up. This coffee will help." Emma didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. "All right, but you know I'm here if you need to talk, right?" Jessica nodded, grateful for her friend's support even as she pushed her away. "Tense, Em, I appreciate it." As they finished their coffee in companionable silence, Jessica's eyes fell on her car keys, hanging by the door. Her stomach churned at the sight of them. "TM," she said, her voice small. "Would you mind if I caught a ride with you to campus today?" And, not feeling up to driving, Emma's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Jessica never asked for rides. She loved the independence her car gave her. "Of course," Emma said slowly. "Everything okay with your car?" Jessica nodded quickly. Yeah, just thought it might be nice to carpool. You know, save the environment and all that." Emma clearly didn't buy it, but she let it slide. "Sure thing. We'll leave in 10. The drive to campus was torturous for Jessica. Every turn made her flinch. Every passing car sent her heart racing. She kept her eyes fixed on her lap, knuckles white as she gripped her backpack. "Jess," Emma's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "We're here." Jessica looked up, surprised to find they were already in the campus parking lot. She'd been so lost in her fear that she'd missed the entire journey. "Thanks for the ride," she mumbled, practically leaping out of the car. "No problem," Emma called after her. "Text me if you need a ride home." Jessica waved in acknowledgement, already hurrying towards her first class. She just needed to get through the day. Everything would be fine if she could just focus on her studies and forget about that stupid dream. But as she settled into her seat in the lecture hall, Jessica found it impossible to concentrate. The professor's words blurred into meaningless noise as her mind kept drifting back to the mountain road. The crash, the fire. "Ms. Thompson," Jessica startled, realizing the professor was addressing her. "I'm sorry, what?" Professor Harris frowned. "I asked if you could explain the concept of cognitive dissonance to the class." Jessica's mind raced. Cognitive dissonance. She knew this. It was the discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs simultaneously. Like believing you're a safe driver while also being terrified of getting behind the wheel because of a dream that felt too real to ignore. "It's, she stammered, aware of her classmates' eyes on her. "It's when you have inconsistent thoughts or beliefs that cause psychological stress." Professor Harris nodded, though he still looked concerned. "That's correct, Miss Thompson. Are you feeling all right? You seem distracted today." Jessica felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm fine, Professor. Just didn't sleep well last night." As the lecture continued, Jessica tried harder to focus, scribbling notes furiously. But the phantom pain of the crash lingered, making it hard to think about anything else. When class finally ended, Jessica bolted for the door, needing fresh air. She found a quiet spot under a tree on the quad and sank to the ground, her back against the rough bark. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, running her hands through her hair. It was just a dream, just a stupid, vivid dream. But even as she said the words, she knew she didn't believe them. The memory of the crash was too detailed, too real. The pain, the fear, the certainty of death. How could her mind have conjured all that from nothing? Jessica pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. Before she could talk herself out of it, she typed recurring nightmares about dying into the search bar. The results made her blood run cold. Page after page of people describing similar experiences, vivid dreams of death that felt more like memories than nightmares. Some claimed they were glimpses of past lives. Others believed they were premonitions of the future. "This is crazy," Jessica whispered. But she couldn't stop reading. She was so engrossed in her research that she didn't notice the time slipping by. The sun was setting by the time she looked up, startled to find the quad nearly empty. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Kane, you okay? Need a ride home?" Jessica hesitated. The thought of getting in a car again made her nauseous, but she couldn't avoid it forever. Could she? "Thanks, but I'm good," she texted back. "See you at home." Gathering her courage, Jessica made her way to the student parking lot. Her little blue Honda sat where she'd left it that morning, innocent and ordinary in the fading light. Jessica's hands trembled as she reached for her car keys, phantom pain shooting through her body as she remembered the impact of the crash, the heat of the flames. "It wasn't real," she said aloud, her voice shaky. "You're being ridiculous, Jess. Just get in the car and go home." Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The familiar smell of her car air freshener hit her, and for a moment, she relaxed. Then she turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and suddenly Jessica was back on that mountain road, careening towards the edge of the cliff. Her breath came in short gasps, her vision blurring with tears. "No, no, no," she whimpered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. A sharp knock on her window made her scream. She turned to see a campus security guard peering in at her, concern etched on his face. "Miss?" His muffled voice came through the glass. "Are you all right?" Jessica forced herself to breathe, to nod. She rolled down the window. "I'm fine," she managed to say. Just a little tired." The guard didn't look convinced. "You sure you're okay to drive? I'd be happy to call you a cab if you need it." For a moment, Jessica was tempted to accept, but the thought of explaining her irrational fear to a stranger was too much to bear. "Really, I'm okay," she insisted, mustering a weak smile. "Thank you for checking." The guard hesitated, then nodded. "All right, drive safe now." As he walked away, Jessica took several deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. She could do this. It was just a short drive home. Nothing was going to happen. Slowly, carefully, she backed out of the parking space and pointed her car towards the exit. Each moment behind the wheel was agony, her body tense and ready for disaster. But nothing happened. No deer jumped out. No oil slicks appeared on the road. By the time Jessica pulled into her apartment complex, her breathing had almost returned to normal. She all but ran from the car to her apartment, fumbling with her keys in her haste to get inside. Only when the door was locked behind her did she allow herself to relax. Emma looked up from the couch, surprise evident on her face. "Jess, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jessica opened her mouth to brush off her concern, to insist once again that everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she burst into tears. "Oh, Jess," Emma said softly, rushing to embrace her friend. "What's going on? Talk to me." And finally, Jessica did. Through her sobs, she told Emma everything: the vivid nightmare, the lingering pain, the paralyzing fear she'd felt behind the wheel. She told her about the research she'd done, the stories she'd read of others with similar experiences. When she finished, she looked up at Emma, half expecting to see judgment or disbelief. Instead, she saw only concern and compassion. "Oh, honey," Emma said, hugging her tightly. "That sounds terrifying. No wonder you've been so off today. Jessica sniffled, wiping her eyes. You don't think I'm crazy? Emma shook her head firmly. Of course not. The deer that had caused her to swerve in the first dream. But the roadside was empty. Nothing but dark trees and shadows. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. It's different, she breathed. Maybe this time her words were cut short by a blinding light that suddenly flooded her rearview mirror. Jessica squinted, her heart leaping into her throat as she saw a massive truck barreling down the mountain road behind her, its high beams turning night into day. No, 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 Jessica chanted, pressing down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, engine whining as it climbed the steep road. But the truck kept gaining, its grille filling her mirror. Jessica's mind raced. This wasn't how it happened before. There was no deer, no cliff. But somehow this felt even worse. The inevitability of it, the helplessness as the truck bore down on her. The blaring of a horn cut through the night, so loud it made Jessica's ears ring. She realized with horror that the truck was trying to pass her on the narrow mountain road. Are you crazy? She screamed, though she knew the truck driver couldn't hear her. There's no room, but the truck kept coming, pulling alongside her car. Jessica looked over and her blood ran cold. The driver's seat was empty. In that moment of shock, Jessica's hands jerked on the wheel. The car swerved, tires screeching as they lost traction on the winding road. Time seemed to slow as Jessica felt the car begin to slide sideways, directly into the path of the driverless truck. The impact was catastrophic. Jessica felt every excruciating moment as the truck crushed her car, the metal frame crumpling like tissue paper. The sound was deafening, screeching tires, crumpling metal, shattering glass, and underneath it all, Jessica's own scream of terror. Pain exploded through her body as she was thrown about in the wreckage. She felt bones snap, flesh tear. The coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. But worst of all was the feeling of being trapped, tinned in the twisted metal that had once been her car. As the dust settled, Jessica found herself staring up at the star-filled sky through the shattered remains of her windshield. She tried to move, to call for help, but her body wouldn't respond. She could only lie there, each breath sending waves of agony through her broken body. Then she smelled it, the acrid scent of gasoline. No, she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. Please, not like this. But fate, or whatever cruel force was orchestrating this nightmare, had no mercy. Jessica saw the first flicker of flames in her peripheral vision, heard the soft whoosh as the fire caught. The heat built quickly, far too quickly to be natural. Jessica could feel it on her skin, could hear the crackle of flames growing ever closer. She wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to escape. But she was trapped, helpless, forced to endure every moment of terror as the fire approached. The flames reached her, and the pain was beyond anything Jessica could have imagined. She felt her skin blister and char, felt the fire consume her. Her screams echoed through the mountain valley, raw and primal. Just when Jessica thought she could endure no more, when she was certain that death must finally claim her, everything shifted. The pain vanished, replaced by a sensation of falling. Jessica gasped, her eyes flying open. She was back in her dorm room, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. For a long moment, she just lay there, chest heaving as she gulped in air. Her hands flew over her body, expecting to find charred flesh and broken bones. But there was nothing. No injuries, no blood. Just the phantom memory of pain and the lingering scent of smoke that wasn't really there. Jess. Emma's voice came through the door, thick with sleep but tinged with worry. Are you okay? I heard you screaming again. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but all that came out was a choked sob. The door creaked open, and Emma's concerned face appeared. Oh, Jess, she said softly. crossing the room to sit on the edge of the bed. "Another nightmare?" Jessica nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Emma wrapped her in a hug, and Jessica clung to her friend like a lifeline. "It was worse this time," Jessica finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "So much worse." Emma stroked her hair soothingly. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jessica shook her head violently. "I can't. I can't." "Okay," Emma said gently. "You don't have to. But Jess, this can't go on. You need help." Jessica pulled back, wiping her eyes. "What do you mean?" Emma's face was serious in the dim light of the room. "I mean professional help, Jess. These nightmares, they're destroying you. You're not sleeping, you're barely eating. You flinch every time you hear a car outside. This isn't healthy." Deep down, Jessica knew her friend was right. But the thought of telling a stranger about her dreams, about the vivid deaths she experienced night after night, made her stomach churn. "I don't know, Em," she said hesitantly. "What if they think I'm crazy?" Emma squeezed her hand. "They won't. And even if they did, isn't that better than going through this every night?" Jessica bit her lip, considering. The memory of the flames, of being trapped and burning alive, was still fresh in her mind. Could she really endure that again? "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll try." Emma smiled, relief evident on her face. "Good. We'll look into therapists in the morning, okay? For now, try to get some rest." But as Emma left the room, closing the door softly behind her, Jessica felt panic rising in her chest. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant death. She reached for her phone, hands shaking as she pulled up her browser. "How to stay awake," she typed, desperate for any solution that would keep her from reliving that horror. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Jessica sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and coffee cups. Her eyes were bloodshot, her body jittery from caffeine. Then she was awake. She'd made it through the night without sleeping, without dying again. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she couldn't do this forever. Sooner or later, she would have to sleep. And when she did, the mountain road would be waiting for her. Jessica hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly as she stared at the lightening sky. "What's happening to me?" she whispered to the empty room. There was no answer, only the soft ticking of her clock and the distant sounds of the campus coming to life outside. Another day was beginning, but for Jessica, it felt like time was running out. How many more deaths could she endure before she lost her grip on reality completely? As she contemplated this, a new, terrifying thought occurred to her. What if these weren't just dreams? What if somehow they were warnings, premonitions of a real danger waiting for her? The thought made her blood run cold. Jessica shook her head, trying to dispel the idea. That was crazy talk. Premonitions weren't real. She was just stressed, that's all. The therapist would help. They had to. But as Jessica finally dragged herself out of bed to face the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that these dreams were more than just her subconscious playing cruel tricks. They felt like a message, a warning. And if that was true, what was she supposed to do about it? With trembling hands, Jessica began to get dressed, her mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. One thing was certain. She couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, and soon, before these dreams, these deaths, consumed her completely. The harsh fluorescent lights of the university library buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on Jessica's pale face. She sat hunched over a computer, her eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. It was 3:27 a.m., and the library was nearly empty save for a few other night owls scattered among the stacks. Jessica's fingers flew across the keyboard, her search history a testament to her desperation. Recurring dreams of death, premonitions in dreams, how to stop nightmares. Sleep deprivation side effects. She'd been here for hours, skipping her classes and ignoring the concerned texts from Emma. The words on the screen blurred together, but she couldn't stop. She had to find an answer, had to find a way to make the dream stop. A hand on her shoulder made her jump, a small scream escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Whoa, easy there," a voice said. Jessica turned to see Mark, a guy from her psychology class, looking at her with concern. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. You okay, Jess? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jessica forced a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just researching for a paper." Mark glanced at her screen, his brow furrowing. "Dream interpretation and sleep disorders? That for Harris's class." "Something like that," Jessica mumbled, quickly minimizing the windows. Mark hesitated, then sat down in the chair next to her. "Nook, I don't want to overstep. But you haven't been in class for days, and now you're here in the middle of the night looking like you haven't slept in a week. What's going on?" Jessica opened her mouth to brush him off, to insist she was fine, but the words stuck in her throat. She was so tired of pretending, of carrying this burden alone. I've been having these dreams," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Nightmares, really. They feel so real, Mark. I die every single night, and each time it's worse than the last." Mark's eyes widened. "Jesus? Chase. That sounds horrible. Have you talked to anyone about this? A counselor, maybe?" Jessica shook her head. "Emma wants me to." "Fine. I'm scared, Mark. What if they think I'm crazy? What if there's really something wrong with me?" "Hey," Mark said gently, placing a hand on her arm. "Having nightmares doesn't make you crazy, but not dealing with them? That might. You need help, Jess." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. "I know. I don't know how to make it stop. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to drive. I can barely function anymore." Mark was quiet for a moment, then he stood up. "Come on," he said, offering her his hand. "Let's get out of here. You need some fresh air and a decent meal, not more computer screens." Jessica hesitated, then nodded, allowing Mark to help her up. As they walked out of the library into the cool night air, she felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. Maybe talking about it, acknowledging the problem out loud, was a first step towards solving it. They ended up at an all-night diner a few blocks from campus. Jessica picked at a plate of fries while Mark sipped his coffee, listening intently as she poured out the whole story. The recurring dreams, the vivid deaths, the paralyzing fear that had taken over her life. "And now I'm terrified to even close my eyes," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm losing my mind, Mark." Mark leaned back in the booth, his face thoughtful. "It sounds to me like your subconscious is trying to tell you something, Jess. These dreams, they're not random. They're always about dying in a car crash, right?" Jessica nodded. "Always on the same mountain road, but it's different each time. Last night, I burned to death." She shuddered at the memory. "Okay, so let's think about this logically," Mark said, slipping into what Jessica recognized as his psych student mode. "What does driving represent to you? Freedom? Independence? Control?" Jessica considered this. "I guess all of those things. I worked so hard to get my license, to save up for my car. It was like a symbol of becoming an adult, you know?" Mark nodded encouragingly. "So maybe these dreams aren't literally about dying in a car crash. Maybe they're about a fear of losing control, of losing your independence." It made sense in a way, but it didn't explain the visceral reality of the dreams, the pain that felt all too real. "But why now?" Jessica asked. "Why are these dreams starting all of a sudden?" Mark shrugged. "Stress? The pressure of college, being away from home. It could be a lot of things. But Jess, the why doesn't matter as much as how you deal with it. You need to talk to a professional." Jessica sighed. pushing her plate away. "You sound like Emma." "Well, Emma's right," Mark said firmly. "Look, my sister went through something similar a few years back. Night terrors, panic attacks, the whole 9 yards. She started seeing this therapist who specializes in sleep disorders and PTSD. It really helped her. I could give you her number if you want." Jessica felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. "You'd do that?" Mark smiled. "Of course. That's what friends are for, right?" As they left the diner, Jessica felt a bit lighter. She had a plan now, a next step. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. "Thanks, Mark," she said as they walked back towards campus. "For listening, for helping. Bye." Her words were cut off by the roar of an engine. A truck rumbled past them, its headlights momentarily blinding in the dark street. Jessica froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, she was back on that mountain road, the driverless truck bearing down on her. Jessica." Mark's voice sounded far away. She could feel his hands on her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Hey, come back to me. You're okay. You're safe." Jessica blinked, the real world slowly coming back into focus. She was on the sidewalk, Mark's worried face in front of her. There was no truck, no mountain road, just a normal street on a normal night. I'm sorry," she stammered, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I don't know what happened." Mark's face was grim. "I think you just had a panic attack, Jess. Come on, let's get you home." The walk back to her dorm was a blur. Jessica was vaguely aware of Mark's arm around her shoulders, guiding her, but her mind was reeling. She'd had panic attacks before, but never like this. Never so vivid, so all-consuming. At her door, Mark hesitated. "Will you be okay? I can stay if you want, or call Emma." Jessica shook her head. "No, I'll be fine. Thank you, Mark." "Really?" He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Okay, but promise me you'll call that therapist tomorrow. And Jess, try to get some sleep. You can't keep going like this." After he left, Jessica stood in the middle of her room, feeling lost. The thought of sleeping terrified her, but she knew Mark was right. She couldn't stay awake forever. With trembling hands, she changed into her pajamas and crawled into bed. She left the lights on, unable to face the darkness. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she tried to focus on her breathing, on the reality of her safe, familiar room. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the truck, heard the crunch of metal, felt the heat of the flames. Jessica's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "I can't do this. I can't." She reached for her phone, pulling up her browser again. But this time, instead of searching for dream interpretations or ways to stay awake, she typed in something new. How to lucid dream. If she couldn't stop the dreams, maybe she could control them. Maybe she could change the outcome, save herself from dying night after night. As the hours ticked by, Jessica immersed herself in techniques for lucid dreaming, reality checks, ways to recognize when you're in a dream. She scribbled notes, made lists of things to try. The sun was rising by the time she finally fell into an exhausted sleep, her phone still clutched in her hand. And as she drifted off, a small part of her hoped that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. But deep down, she knew the mountain road was waiting for her, and this time she was determined to face it head-on. Jessica sat in the waiting room of Dr. Amelia Chen's office, her leg bouncing nervously. The walls were a soothing shade of blue, adorned with abstract paintings that were probably meant to be calming. To Jessica, they looked like swirling vortexes, threatening to pull her in. She glanced at her watch. 2:57 p.m. Her appointment was at 3 o'clock. She'd arrived an hour early, unable to bear sitting in her dorm room any longer. The receptionist had given her a concerned look but hadn't commented. Jessica's eyes darted to the door every time it opened, her heart racing. What if Dr. Chun took one look at her and decided she was beyond help? What if talking about the dreams made them worse? Jessica Thompson? A gentle voice called. Jessica's head snapped up to see a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a warm smile. Dr. Chun, she presumed. That's me, Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stood. Dr. Chen's smile widened. It's nice to meet you, Jessica. Please, come in. The office was cozy, with a comfortable-looking couch and a plush armchair. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with psychology texts and self-help books. Jessica perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. So, Jessica, Dr. Chun began, settling into the armchair across from her. What brings you here today? Jessica took a deep breath. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times in her head, but now that it was here, the words seemed to stick in her throat. I've been having nightmares, she finally managed. Really bad ones. Every night. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. Can you tell me more about these nightmares? Jessica closed her eyes, the familiar scene playing out in her mind. I'm driving on this mountain road. It's always the same road, and I always die, but it's different each time. Sometimes I drive off a cliff. Sometimes I crash into a truck. Last time I burned to death. Her voice broke on the last words, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes. When she opened them, she expected to see shock or disbelief on Dr. Chen's face. Instead, she saw only compassion. That sounds terrifying, Jessica, Dr. Chen said softly. How long has this been going on? About 2 weeks now, Jessica replied, wiping her eyes. But it feels like forever. I'm afraid to sleep. I can barely function during the day. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. You're not losing your mind, Jessica. Recurring nightmares can be a symptom of underlying stress or trauma. Have you experienced any significant changes or stressful events recently? Jessica shook her head. Not really. I mean, college is stressful, but nothing out of the ordinary. That's what makes this so frustrating. There's no reason for these dreams. Dreams don't always have a clear, logical reason, Dr. Chun explained. They're often our brain's way of processing emotions or fears we might not even be consciously aware of. Let's talk about the dreams themselves. You mentioned you're always driving. How do you feel about driving in real life? Jessica considered this. I used to love it. It was freedom, you know? But now I can barely look at my car without having a panic attack. Dr. Chun made a note on her pad. And in the dreams, are you alone in the car? Yes, Jessica nodded. Always alone. Interesting, Dr. Chun mused. And try. First, I'd like you to start keeping a dream journal. Write down everything you remember as soon as you wake up, no matter how small the detail. Jessica nodded eagerly. I can do that. What else? We'll also work on some relaxation techniques to help you before bed. And I want to teach you about lucid dreaming. It's a technique where you become aware that you're dreaming and can sometimes control the dream. Jessica's eyes widened. I've been reading about that. I tried it last night, but it didn't work. Dr. Chun smiled encouragingly. It takes practice. We'll work on it together. Now, I also want to talk about medication options. There are some medications that can help reduce nightmares, especially in cases of PTSD or anxiety disorders. Jessica felt her stomach clench. Medication? Do you think there's something really wrong with me? Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but firm. Having nightmares doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, Jessica. But if they're interfering with your daily life as much as you've described, medication might help you get some relief while we work on addressing the underlying issues. They spent the rest of the session discussing Jessica's sleep habits, her daily routine, and her support system. By the time the hour was up, Jessica felt drained but also, for the first time in weeks, hopeful. "Here's a prescription for a low dose of Prozasine," Dr. Chon said, handing Jessica a slip of paper. "It's commonly used to treat nightmares, especially in PTSD patients, and I want to see you again next week. In the meantime, start that dream journal and try the relaxation exercises we discussed." Jessica nodded, clutching the prescription like a lifeline. "Thank you, Dr. Chen. Really." As she left the office, Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't cured, not by a long shot, but she had a plan now. She had hope. That evening, Jessica sat cross-legged on her bed, a new notebook open in front of her. She'd filled the first page with notes from her session with Dr. Chan, and now she was preparing for bed with a mix of anticipation and dread. Emma poked her head into the room. "Tang, how'd it go with the therapist?" Jessica managed a small smile. "It was good, actually. She gave me some things to try, and a prescription." Emma's face lit up. "That's great, Jess. I'm so proud of you for going." "Thanks, Em," Jessica said softly, "for everything. I don't know what I'd do without you." Emma crossed the room and gave Jessica a tight hug. "That's what friends are for. Now get some sleep. Okay? And remember, I'm right next door if you need me." As Emma left, Jessica took a deep breath and swallowed the small pill Dr. Chan had prescribed. Then she lay down, forcing herself to relax each muscle group as Dr. Chan had taught her. "You're safe," she whispered to herself. "It's just a dream. You're in control." Despite her fear, exhaustion soon took over, and Jessica felt herself drifting off. As sleep claimed her, she clung to one last conscious thought. "I'm dreaming. This is a dream. I'm in control." The mountain road materialized around her, as vivid and terrifying as ever. But this time, as Jessica gripped the steering wheel, she felt a flicker of something new. Awareness. "This is a dream," she said aloud, her voice shaky but determined. "I'm dreaming, and I'm in control." The car swerved, and Jessica saw the familiar truck appear in her rearview mirror. But instead of panicking, she took a deep breath. "No," she said firmly. "Not this time. I choose what happens." It was all her willpower. Jessica imagined the truck disappearing. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, like a mirage fading in the desert, the truck shimmered and vanished. Jessica let out a breathless laugh of disbelief and relief. She'd done it. She changed the dream. But her victory was short-lived. The road ahead began to twist and warp, defying the laws of physics. The sky turned a sickly green, and Jessica felt the car begin to lift off the ground. "No!" she cried out. "This isn't what I want." But the dream was slipping out of her control. The car spun wildly, and Jessica felt the familiar terror rising in her chest. As the ground rushed up to meet her, she squeezed her eyes shut and screamed. Jessica bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. She was in her room, safe in her bed. Sunlight streamed through the window. She'd made it through the night. With shaking hands, she reached for her dream journal and began to write. The nightmare hadn't stopped entirely, but she'd controlled it, if only for a moment. It was progress. As she wrote, Jessica felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Fear was still there, yes, but also a spark of determination. She'd faced the nightmare and, for a brief moment, launched. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "One day at a time," she murmured to herself, echoing Dr. Chen's words. One dream at a time. She didn't know if she'd ever fully conquer these nightmares. But for the first time since they'd started, Jessica felt something she'd almost forgotten. Tolt. And for now, that was enough to keep going, to face another day, another night, another dream. Jessica stared at the small white pill in her palm, her reflection distorted in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles ringed her eyes, a testament to weeks of fitful sleep and terrifying nightmares. Dr. Chun had assured her that prazosin was safe, that it could help reduce the intensity of her dreams. But after last night's partial success with lucid dreaming, Jessica hesitated. "Come on, Jess," she muttered to herself. "It's just a pill. It's supposed to help." With a deep breath, she tossed the pill into her mouth and washed it down with a gulp of water. As she made her way back to her bed, she tried to focus on the relaxation techniques Dr. Chan had taught her. "You're safe," she whispered, settling under the covers. "It's just a dream. You're in control." As sleep began to claim her, Jessica clung to consciousness for as long as she could, repeating her mantra. "I'm dreaming. This is a dream. I'm in control." The familiar mountain road materialized around her, but something was different. The colors seemed more vivid, almost painfully bright. The trees lining the road twisted and writhed like living things, their branches reaching out towards her car like grasping fingers. Jessica gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "This is a dream," she said aloud, her voice shaky. "I'm in control." But the words felt hollow, drowned out by the surreal landscapes surrounding her. The road ahead began to undulate, rising and falling like waves on an ocean. Jessica's stomach lurched as the car crested each peak, momentarily airborne before crashing back down. "No," she whimpered. "This isn't right. Wake up, Jess. Wake up." But she couldn't. The dream held her in its grip, more vivid and terrifying than ever before. The sky above turned a sickly green, roiling with storm clouds that seemed to form faces, leering down at her. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Jessica slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere inches from the person. Her heart nearly stopped as she recognized the face staring back at her through the windshield. It was herself. The other Jessica smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that stretched too wide across her face. "Going somewhere?" her doppelganger asked, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "This isn't real," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "You're not real. I'm in control here." The other Jessica laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Are you sure about that?" Before Jessica could respond, her double began to change. Its skin bubbled and melted, reforming into a grotesque amalgamation of all the ways she had died in her previous dreams. One arm was crushed and mangled, the other blackened and charred. Half of its face was bloody and torn, while the other half was pristine, still wearing that terrible smile. Jessica screamed, throwing the car into reverse. But the wheel spun uselessly, unable to gain traction on the writhing road beneath. The monstrous version of herself reached out, its fingers elongating into razor-sharp claws that scraped against the windshield. "You can't escape yourself, Jessica," it hissed, its voice now a chorus of all her past screams. "You can't outrun your fears." The claws pierced through the glass, inching closer to Jessica's face. She pressed herself back against the seat, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Wake up," she pleaded, squeezing her eyes shut. "Trees, God, let me wake up." But the dream wouldn't release her. She felt the cold touch of those claws against her cheek, and her eyes snapped open. The monster that wore her face was now inside the car, its twisted body contorting to fit in the passenger seat. "Why are you doing this?" Jessica sobbed. "What do you want from me?" The creature's smile widened impossibly further, splitting its face in two. "I want you to face the truth, Jessica. The truth you've been running from." "What truth?" Jessica asked, her voice barely a whisper. The monster leaned in close, its breath hot and rancid against her ear. "That you're the one behind the wheel. You're the one in control. And you're the one who keeps choosing to die." With those words, the creature lunged forward, its jaws unhinging like a snake's. Jessica felt a moment of searing pain as it began to devour her, starting with her face. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was being consumed, not just physically but mentally, her very essence being torn apart and absorbed by this nightmarish version of herself. As the pain reached a crescendo, the dream shattered like a broken mirror. Jessica bolted upright in bed, a scream tearing from her throat. She thrashed wildly, tangled in her sweat-soaked sheets, her mind still half-trapped in the nightmare. Jessica, Emma's voice cut through the fog of terror. Jessica felt hands on her shoulders, shaking her gently. It's okay, you're awake. You're safe. Slowly, reality began to reassert itself. Jessica's eyes focused on Emma's worried face, then darted around the familiar surroundings of her dorm room. She was safe. She was awake. It was over, but the relief was short-lived. As the adrenaline faded, Jessica became aware of a sharp pain in her arm. She looked down to see four parallel scratches running from her wrist to her elbow, beads of blood welling up along the marks. "Oh my God!" Emma gasped, following Jessica's gaze. "Did you do that to yourself?" Jessica stared at the scratches, her mind reeling. They were in the exact same place where the monster in her dream had grabbed her. I don't know," she stammered. "I don't remember." Emma was already moving, grabbing the first aid kit they kept in the room. "It's okay, we'll get you cleaned up. Just try to breathe, Jess." As Emma tended to her arm, Jessica's thoughts raced. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, more than any of the others. And now this, had she really clawed at herself in her sleep? Or was something more sinister at work? "There," Emma said, finishing up with a bandage. "All better. Do you want to talk about it?" Jessica shook her head, still trembling. "I can't. Not right now." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Okay, but I'm here when you're ready. Do you want me to stay with you?" "No," Jessica said quickly, then softened her tone at Emma's hurt look. "I mean, thank you, but I need to be alone for a bit, to process." After Emma reluctantly left, Jessica reached for her dream journal with shaking hands. As she began to write, tears splashed onto the page, smearing the ink. The dream had been horrifying enough, but the words of her monstrous doppelganger echoed in her mind. "You're the one who keeps choosing to die." What did that mean? Was her subconscious trying to tell her something? Or was it just the product of her fears and the new medication? Jessica's eyes fell on the bottle of Prozasine on her nightstand. With a sudden surge of anger, she grabbed it and hurled it across the room. The pills scattered across the floor, tiny white reminders of her failure to find an easy solution. She buried her face in her hands, sobs racking her body. She was tired, so tired. Tired of the fear, tired of the sleepless nights, tired of feeling like she was losing her grip on reality. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Jessica made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. With trembling fingers, she picked up her phone and dialed Dr. Chen's emergency number. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Dr. Chen? It's Jessica Thompson. I need help. Can I come see you today? It's urgent." As she hung up, having secured an emergency appointment for later that morning, Jessica felt a mix of dread and determination. She didn't know what Dr. Chen would say, what new strategies they might try, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't face another night like this one. Something had to give, and soon. Jessica looked at her reflection in the mirror, taking in the wild eyes, the tangled hair, the bandage on her arm. "No more running," she whispered to herself. "It's time to face whatever this is, head on." As she began to get ready for her appointment, Jessica felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a grim resolve. Whatever was causing these nightmares, Whatever truth her subconscious was trying to tell her, she would face it, because the alternative, losing herself to these dreams, to the terror that threatened to consume her, was no longer an option. It was time to take control, in her dreams and in her waking life. It was time to fight back. The harsh fluorescent lights of the 24-hour convenience store buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on Jessica's pale face. She stood in the middle of the aisle, staring at the shelves stocked with energy drinks and caffeine pills. Her hands trembled as she reached for a bottle, then another, and another. "Hey, you okay, miss?" The clerk's voice made her jump. She turned to see a young man eyeing her with concern. Jessica forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Fina, just pulling an all-nighter for exams." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was easier than explaining the truth. How could she tell the stranger that she was terrified of falling asleep? That every time she closed her eyes, she died in increasingly horrific ways? She approached the counter, arms laden with enough stimulants to keep a small army awake. The clerk raised an eyebrow but rang up her purchases without comment. As Jessica left the store, the cold night air hit her face, momentarily clearing the fog of exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She checked her watch. 3:17 a.m. Another night stretching endlessly before her. Another battle against sleep. Back in her dorm room, Jessica arranged her arsenal on her desk. Energy drinks, caffeine pills, her laptop open to a playlist of loud, aggressive music. Anything to keep her awake, to stave off the nightmares that waited in the darkness of sleep. She popped open a can, the sharp hiss breaking the silence of the early morning. As she took a long swig, her eyes fell on the prescription bottle of Prozasine, still scattered across the floor from when she'd thrown it earlier. Dr. Chen's words echoed in her mind. "Avoiding sleep isn't a solution, Jessica. It's only going to make things worse." Jessica shook her head, as if she could physically dislodge the memory. "What does she know?" she muttered to herself. "She's not the one dying every night." Hours passed in a caffeinated haze. Jessica paced her small room, to jumping jacks, anything to keep moving, to keep awake. But as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, she felt her resolve wavering. A soft knock at her door made her heart leap into her throat. "Jess," Emma's voice came through, thick with sleep but tinged with worry. "Are you up? I heard noises." Jessica froze, unsure whether to answer. After a moment, she heard Emma sigh and walk away. Jilt nod at her. She was pushing everyone away, isolating herself in her fear. As the day wore on, Jessica felt herself unraveling. The caffeine that had kept her wired now left her jittery and nauseous. Her thoughts raced, jumping from one scenario to another. What if she never slept again? What if the dreams followed her into the waking world? By afternoon, she was a wreck. She sat on the floor, back against her bed, surrounded by empty cans and pill bottles. Her phone buzzed incessantly, missed calls and texts from Emma, from her parents, from Dr. Chun. She ignored them all. A new, terrifying thought began to take root in her mind. What if the only way to escape the dreams was to make them real? To face her fear head-on once and for all? With shaking hands, she reached for her car keys. The metal felt cold and heavy in her palm. A promise and a threat all at once. Jessica stumbled to her feet, the room spinning around her. She made it to the door before a wave of dizziness hit her, sending her crashing to her knees. "Jess? Oh my God, Jess." Emma's voice seemed to come from far away. Jessica felt hands on her shoulders, heard the panic in her friend's voice as if through water. "I have to go," Jessica mumbled, trying to stand. "Have to make it stop." "Make what stop?" "Jess, you're scaring me." "What's going on?" Jessica looked up at Emma, really seeing her for the first time in days. The concern in her friend's eyes broke something inside her. "The dreams," she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't do it anymore, Em. I keep dying every night, and it hurts. It hurts so much." Emma's face paled. "Oh, Jess, why didn't you tell me it was getting worse? Come on, let's get you up." With Emma's help, Jessica made it back to her bed. She sank onto the mattress, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "I'm calling Dr. Chun," Emma said firmly, reaching for Jessica's phone. "Lo," Jessica cried, grabbing Emma's wrist. "No more doctors, no more pills. I need it to stop." Emma sat beside her, gently prying Jessica's fingers from her wrist. "And how were you planning to make it stop, Jess? Where were you going with your keys?" Jessica looked away, shame burning in her cheeks. "I thought, maybe if I made it real, if I faced it." "Jesus, Jess," Emma breathed, realization dawning on her face. "You were going to crash your car? Are you insane?" The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She curled in on herself, sobs racking her body. "Maybe I am," she choked out. "Maybe I'm losing my mind." Emma wrapped her arms around Jessica, holding her tight. "You're not insane. You're exhausted and terrified. But this isn't the answer, Jess. You need help. Real help." For a long moment, they sat in silence, Jessica's sobs gradually subsiding into hiccuping breaths. Finally, she spoke, her voice small and broken. "What if it never stops, Em? What if I have to live with this forever?" Emma pulled back, looking Jessica in the eye. "Then we'll face it together. But first you need to sleep." "Brielle?" Brubis laughed. Jessica shook her head violently. "No, I can't. The dreams?" "I'll be right here," Emma interrupted. "I'll wake you if it looks like you're having a nightmare. But Jess, you can't go on like this. You're going to kill yourself one way or another if you don't rest." The truth of Emma's words hit Jessica hard. She was at the end of her rope, teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe she just needed to surrender to sleep, to face whatever came. "Okay," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Okay." Emma helped her change into pajamas, then tucked her into bed like a child. As Jessica's eyes began to close, heavy with days of missed sleep, she felt Emma's hand in hers. "I'm right here." Emma's voice came from far away. "You're safe. Just sleep." Jessica felt herself drifting, falling into the familiar darkness. But this time, instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever waited for her in her dreams, she wouldn't face it alone. The mountain road materialized around her, as vivid as ever. But something was different. As Jessica gripped the steering wheel, she realized what it was. The passenger seat wasn't empty. Emma sat beside her, a comforting presence in the midst of the nightmare landscape. "It's okay, Jess," Emma said, her voice steady and sure. "We'll get through this together." As the road twisted and turned before them, Jessica felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Told she wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference. The dream continued, filled with the usual terrors, the truck, the cliff, the fire. But each time Jessica felt herself starting to panic, she looked over at Emma. Her friend's presence anchored her, reminded her that this wasn't real, that she would wake up. When Jessica finally opened her eyes, sunlight was streaming through her window. She'd slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Emma was still there, dozing in the chair beside her bed, their hands still clasped together. As Jessica stirred, Emma's eyes fluttered open. "Tay," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" Jessica took a moment to assess. She was still tired, still afraid. The nightmares weren't gone, but something had shifted. She didn't feel alone anymore. "Better," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I think," I think I'm ready to really fight this now. Emma smiled, squeezing her hand. That's my girl. And I'll be right here with you, every step of the way. As they began to plan their next steps, a return visit to Dr. Chen, a new sleep routine, strategies for coping with the nightmares, Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would be hard, she knew, but she wasn't walking it alone anymore. And for now, that was enough to keep going, to face another day, another night, another dream. Because sometimes, the first step towards healing is simply admitting you need help. And Jessica had finally taken that step. The waiting room of Dr. Chen's office felt different this time. Jessica sat straighter in her chair, her eyes clearer despite the lingering exhaustion. Emma sat beside her, a steady presence that kept Jessica's nerves from completely unraveling. "You've got this, Jess?" Emma whispered, squeezing her hand as Dr. Chen's door opened. Dr. Chen's eyes widened slightly as she took in Jessica's appearance. The dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, the determined set of her jaw. "Jessica, please come in," Dr. Chen said, her voice warm but concerned. She glanced at Emma. "Would you like your friend to join us?" Jessica nodded. "Yes, please. I need her here." Once they were settled in Dr. Chen's office, Jessica took a deep breath and began to recount everything that had happened since their last session. The intensifying nightmares, the desperate attempts to stay awake, the moment of crisis that had brought her to the brink of a terrible decision. Her voice shook at times, and she pushed through, Emma's hand in hers anchoring her to the present. Dr. Chen listened intently, her face a mask of professional concern. When Jessica finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. "Thank you for sharing all of this, Jessica," Dr. Chen finally said. "I can see how much you've been struggling. I'm glad you reached out for help when you did." Jessica nodded, feeling a mix of shame and relief. "I know I should have called you sooner. I felt like I was losing control of everything." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Jessica, I want you to understand something. What you're experiencing, these vivid, recurring nightmares, it's a real condition. It's not just bad dreams, and it's not something you should have to face alone. So what do we do?" Emma asked, her voice tight with worry. "How do we help her?" Dr. Chen sat back, considering. "I think we need to take a multifaceted approach. First, Jessica, I want to adjust your medication. The prazosin clearly wasn't effective, and may have even exacerbated your symptoms." Jessica flinched at the memory of that horrific, drug-induced nightmare. "I don't know if I want to try more medication," she said hesitantly. "I understand your hesitation," Dr. Chen said gently, "but I believe a low dose of a different medication, combined with intensive therapy, could really help. We'll monitor you closely, I promise." Jessica glanced at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. "Okay," Jessica said softly. "I'll try." "Good," Dr. Chen smiled. "Now, about the therapy. I think we need to directly address these nightmares. Not just talk about them, but confront them head-on." Jessica felt her heart rate quicken. "What do you mean?" Dr. Chen's eyes gleamed with a mix of excitement and determination. "I want to try something called imagery rehearsal therapy. Essentially, we'll work on reimagining and rewriting your nightmare scenario while you're awake. The goal is to give you more control when you encounter it in your dreams." Like lucid dreaming?" Jessica asked, remembering her brief moment of control in an earlier dream. "Similar, yes," Dr. Chen nodded. "But this is more about changing the narrative of the dream itself. We'll practice visualizing a different, less frightening outcome to your car crash scenario." Emma squeezed Jessica's hand. "That sounds promising, doesn't it, Jess?" Jessica nodded slowly, hope blooming in her chest for the first time in weeks. "Yeah, it does. But how do we do it?" Dr. Chen smiled. We'll start right now if you're up for it. Close your eyes, Jessica. I want you to visualize that mountain road. Jessica hesitated, fear coiling in her stomach, but she felt Emma's hand in hers, heard Dr. Chen's calm, steady voice. Slowly, she closed her eyes. I see it, she whispered, the familiar curves of the road appearing in her mind's eye. Good. Dr. Chen's voice came from far away. Now you're in the car, but this time you're in control. The car responds perfectly to your touch. The road is clear, the weather is beautiful. Can you see it? Jessica furrowed her brow, concentrating. Gradually, the nightmarish elements of her dream began to fade. The twisting trees straightened. The sickly green sky turned a brilliant blue. She felt her hands on the wheel, steady and sure. I can see it, she said, her voice stronger. I'm driving. It's okay. Excellent, Dr. Chen encouraged. Now I want you to drive to the end of that road. See yourself reaching your destination safely. Can you do that? Jessica took a deep breath, imagining the car moving smoothly along the road. In her mind, she rounded the final bend, expecting disaster. But instead, she saw a beautiful vista spread out before her: mountains, forests, a serene lake in the distance. I made it, Jessica breathed, opening her eyes. She was surprised to find tears on her cheeks. I actually made it to the end, Dr. Chen beamed. That's wonderful, Jessica. This is just the beginning, but it's a powerful start. I want you to practice this visualization every day. The more you can reimagine this scenario with a positive outcome, the more likely you are to carry that into your dreams. Jessica nodded eagerly, feeling a spark of determination. I can do that. What else? We'll continue with our sessions, working through any underlying anxieties or stressors that might be contributing to these nightmares, Dr. Chen explained. And I have one more suggestion, though it might sound a bit unconventional. Jessica and Emma exchanged glances. What is it? Jessica asked. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. I think you need to confront this fear in the real world, Jessica. I want you to take a drive on a mountain road. The room fell silent. Jessica felt her heart pounding in her chest, fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins. You want me to drive? On a real mountain road? Dr. Chen nodded. I know it sounds frightening, but facing our fears in a controlled, safe environment can be incredibly powerful. We'd plan it carefully, of course. Choose a safe road, go during daylight hours. You wouldn't be alone. I'll go with her, Emma said immediately, squeezing Jessica's hand. Every step of the way, Jessica's mind raced. The thought of getting behind the wheel, of driving on a road like the one in her nightmares, terrified her. But a small part of her recognized the potential power in it. To face her fear head-on, to prove to herself that she could do it. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. Dr. Chen smiled warmly. I'm proud of you, Jessica. This is a big step. We'll plan it for a couple of weeks from now. Give you time to work with the visualization techniques and get used to the new medication. As they left Dr. Chen's office, Jessica felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. Emma chatted animatedly beside her, already making plans for their road trip. We'll make a day of it, Jess, she was saying. Pack a picnic. Find a nice spot with a view. It'll be like an adventure. Jessica managed a small smile. An adventure, she repeated. The word tasted foreign on her tongue, so far removed from the terror that had consumed her life these past weeks. That night, as Jessica prepared for bed, she felt a familiar fear creeping in. But this time she was armed with new tools, new hope. She settled into bed, Emma once again keeping vigil in the chair beside her. Remember, Emma said softly, I'm right here, and you're in control, Jess. It's your dream. Jessica nodded, closing her eyes. As she drifted off, she focused on the visualization Dr. Chun had taught her. The safe car, the beautiful day, the road that led to a breathtaking view instead of disaster. The mountain road materialized around her, as vivid as ever. But this time, Jessica didn't feel helpless. She gripped the wheel, took a deep breath, and began to drive. "It's my dream," she said aloud, her voice steady. "And I choose how it ends." As she drove, the nightmare elements tried to creep in, the twisting trees, the looming truck in her rearview mirror. But Jessica focused on her breathing, on the feeling of control. She pictured Emma beside her, Dr. Chen's voice in her ear. Slowly, the terrifying elements began to fade. When Jessica woke the next morning, she felt different. The nightmare hadn't completely disappeared, but she'd faced it, controlled it even if just a little. "How was it?" Emma asked, stifling a yawn. Jessica considered for a moment. "It was better," she said finally. "Not perfect, but better. I think this might actually work." As they began to plan for the day ahead, Jessica felt a newfound determination. The road ahead would be challenging, she knew, but for the first time in weeks, she felt ready to face it. One day at a time, one dream at a time, she would reclaim her life from these nightmares. And in 2 weeks, she would face her ultimate test, the real mountain road. But with Emma by her side and her new tools at her disposal, Jessica allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this nightmare into an adventure after all. The early morning sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Jessica stood in the parking lot of her dorm, keys clutched tightly in her hand, staring at her car as if it might suddenly come to life and attack her. "You ready for this?" Emma's voice came from behind her, gentle but encouraging. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to quell the panic rising in her chest. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of therapy sessions, medication adjustments, and constant practice with Dr. Chen's visualization techniques. Jessica had made progress, but the thought of actually driving on a mountain road still filled her with dread. Emma placed a reassuring hand on Jessica's shoulder. "Remember, I'm with you every step of the way. We can turn back any time you want." Jessica nodded, taking another deep breath. "No, we're doing this. I need to do this." With trembling hands, she unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. The familiar smell of leather and her lavender air freshener washed over her, simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Emma got in the passenger side, shooting Jessica an encouraging smile. "Okay," Jessica muttered to herself, gripping the steering wheel. "It's just a car, just a road. You can do this." She turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Jessica flinched at the sound, memories of her nightmares flashing through her mind. But she pushed them aside, focusing on her breathing like Dr. Chan had taught her. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Emma chatted lightly about their plans for the day, clearly trying to distract Jessica from her fears. "I packed us a great picnic," she was saying, "and I found this amazing lookout point we can stop at. The views are supposed to be incredible." Jessica managed a small smile, grateful for her friend's efforts. The first part of the drive was familiar city streets giving way to suburbs, then to more rural areas. But as they approached the foothills, Jessica felt her anxiety spike. "We're getting close," she said, her voice tight. "The turnoff for the mountain road should be coming up soon." Emma nodded, her voice calm and steady. "You're doing great, Jess. Remember, we can take breaks whenever you need to. No pressure." The sign for the mountain road loomed ahead. Jessica's hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles turning white. As they made the turn, the road began to wind upwards, trees closing in on either side. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. It was so similar to her nightmares, the twisting road, the looming trees. For a moment, she felt paralyzed by fear. Jess. Emma's voice cut through the panic. You okay? Do you need to pull over? Jessica shook her head, forcing herself to focus. No, I'm okay. Just give me a minute. She pulled the car to the side of the road, closing her eyes and taking several deep breaths. In her mind, she pictured the visualization Dr. Chan had taught her: the safe car, the beautiful day, the road leading to a breathtaking view. You've got this, she whispered to herself. It's just a road. You're in control. After a few moments, Jessica opened her eyes, feeling calmer. She looked over at Emma, who gave her an encouraging nod. Ready to keep going? Emma asked. Jessica nodded, pulling back onto the road. As they continued their ascent, she found herself relaxing slightly. The road was challenging, with its sharp turns and steep inclines, but it wasn't the nightmare scenario she had feared. They drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on asphalt. Jessica's confidence grew with each successfully navigated turn. Then, as they rounded a particularly sharp bend, a deer darted out onto the road. Jessica's heart leapt into her throat, her body reacting before her mind could process what was happening. She swerved instinctively, just like in her dreams. Jess, Emma cried out, grabbing the dashboard. For a terrifying moment, Jessica was sure they were going to crash. She could see it all playing out just like in her nightmares. The car spinning out of control, plummeting off the cliff. But then, something different happened. Instead of losing control, Jessica felt a sudden clarity. Time seemed to slow down. She remembered Dr. Chen's words. You are in control, Jessica. Even in the most frightening moments, you have the power to choose your actions. With a steady hand, Jessica corrected the wheel, bringing the car smoothly back into their lane. The deer bounded off into the forest, unharmed. They were safe. Jessica let out a shaky breath, pulling the car over to the side of the road. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from the realization of what she had just done. Oh my God, Jess, Emma breathed, her face pale. You were amazing. Are you okay? Jessica turned to her friend, a disbelieving laugh bubbling up from her chest. I'm okay. I'm better than okay. Emma, did you see that? I didn't crash. I didn't freeze. I handled it. Emma's face broke into a wide grin. You absolutely did. You're a rock star, Jess. The two friends sat there for a moment, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Jessica had faced her worst fear, a real-life version of her recurring nightmare, and she had conquered it. I think, Jessica said slowly, I'm ready to keep going, all the way to the top. Emma squeezed her hand. Lead the way, Captain. As they continued their ascent, Jessica felt a newfound confidence behind the wheel. The road was still challenging, but it no longer felt like a threat. Instead, it felt like an adventure. They reached the lookout point Emma had mentioned, pulling into a small parking area. As they got out of the car, Jessica took in the breathtaking views spread out before them in miles of forested mountains. A crystal-clear lake nestled in the valley below, the sky a perfect, cloudless blue. Wow, Jessica breathed, walking to the edge of the lookout. It's beautiful. Emma came to stand beside her, bumping her shoulder playfully. See? I told you the view would be worth it. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, soaking in the peaceful scene. Jessica felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over her. She had done it. She had faced her fear and come out the other side. You know, Jessica said finally, turning to Emma with a smile. I think I'm ready for that picnic now. I'm starving. As they sat on a blanket, enjoying the food Emma had packed and chatting about everything and nothing, Jessica felt lighter than she had in weeks. The nightmares that had plagued her seemed distant now, less powerful in the face of what she had accomplished. Hey, Em, Jessica said, her voice soft. Thank you. For everything. I couldn't have done this without you. Emma smiled, reaching out to squeeze Jessica's hand. That's what friends are for. But Jess, you're the real hero here. You faced your fears head on. I'm so proud of you. Jessica felt tears prick at her eyes. But for once, they were tears of joy and relief rather than fear and frustration. I didn't I? I actually did it. As the afternoon wore on, Jessica found herself dreading the drive back less and less. When it was time to leave, she got behind the wheel with only a slight flutter of nervousness in her stomach. The drive down the mountain was almost enjoyable. Jessica found herself appreciating the beauty of the road, the skill required to navigate its twists and turns. It was challenging, yes, but no longer terrifying. As they pulled back into the dorm parking lot, the sun setting behind them, Jessica felt a sense of closure. She had come full circle, facing her nightmares both in her dreams and in reality. So, Emma said as they got out of the car, "Same time next week?" Jessica laughed. A full, genuine laugh that felt foreign after weeks of fear and stress. You know what? Maybe. I think I might actually enjoy a drive like that again. As they walked back to their dorm, Jessica felt a profound shift within herself. The nightmares might not be gone completely. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, therapy to continue, fears to face. But she had proven to herself that she was stronger than her fears. She had taken control of her story, both in her dreams and in her waking life. For the first time in weeks, Jessica looked forward to sleep, curious to see how her dreams might have changed. As she drifted off that night, the mountain road appeared in her mind. But this time, it wasn't a source of terror. Instead, it was an invitation to an adventure, a challenge to be met and overcome. And Jessica was ready to face it, one dream at a time. The weeks following Jessica's triumphant mountain drive had been a whirlwind of progress. Her sessions with Dr. Chun had become more about managing everyday stress than battling nightmares. She'd even started enjoying driving again, taking weekend trips with Emma to explore nearby towns and scenic routes. But as Jessica sat in Dr. Chen's office for what was meant to be one of her final sessions, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. "You've made remarkable progress, Jessica," Dr. Chun was saying, her smile warm and encouraging. "How have you been sleeping?" Jessica hesitated, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. "Mostly good," she said slowly. "Fine." Dr. Chun leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "But I had a dream last night," Jessica admitted. It wasn't like the others. Felt different, more real, somehow." Dr. Chun nodded, her pen poised over her notepad. "Can you tell me about it?" Jessica closed her eyes, the vivid images from her dream flooding back. "I was driving on the mountain road again, but this time I wasn't afraid. I felt confident, in control." "That sounds like progress," Dr. Chun encouraged. Jessica shook her head. "At first, yes, but then something changed. The road started to look familiar, but not from my nightmares. It was the actual road we drove on, the one with Emma. And then," she trailed off, her throat tightening. "It's okay, Jessica," Dr. Chun said gently. "Take your time." Jessica took a deep breath. "I saw myself, another me, standing in the middle of the road. She looked wrong, twisted, like all the ways I died in my dreams combined into one horrible version of myself. And she said this was my last chance, that it was time to face the truth." Dr. Chen's face remained neutral, but Jessica could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "And how did that make you feel?" "Terrified," Jessica whispered, "but also determined, like I knew this was it. The final confrontation." Dr. Chun was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen against her notepad. "Jessica, I think you've reached a critical point in your recovery. This dream seems to be your subconscious telling you it's time to fully confront whatever is at the root of these nightmares. Jessica nodded, a mix of fear and determination swirling in her gut. So what do I do? Dr. Chen's eyes met hers, intense and serious. I think you need to go back to that mountain road. Alone this time. Jessica felt her heart skip a beat. Alone? But I know it's scary, Dr. Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. But you've proven you can handle it. You're not the same person you were when these nightmares started. You're stronger now, more in control. Jessica bit her lip, considering. The thought of driving that road alone terrified her. But a part of her knew Dr. Chen was right. This was something she needed to face on her own. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. The next morning dawned clear and bright. A perfect day for a drive. Jessica stood in the parking lot, keys in hand, staring at her car. Emma stood beside her. Worry edged on her face. Are you sure about this, Jess? Emma asked for what felt like the 100th time. I can come with you. Or we could wait. Do this another day. Jessica shook her head, forcing a smile. I'm sure. I need to do this, Em. For myself. Emma pulled her into a tight hug. Okay, but you call me the second you get to the lookout point. Got it? And if anything feels off, you turn around immediately. Jessica nodded, hugging her friend back fiercely. I promise. As she pulled out of the parking lot, Jessica felt a strange calm settle over her. Whatever happened today, she knew it would be a turning point. One way or another, this would end. The drive to the mountain road was uneventful, the familiar scenery passing by in a blur. But as Jessica made the turn onto the winding road that had haunted her dreams for so long, she felt a shift in the air. Everything seemed more vivid, more real somehow. It's just a road, she muttered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. You've done this before. You can do it again. She navigated the twists and turns with growing confidence, remembering the techniques Dr. Chen had taught her. Breathe. Stay present. You're in control. As she rounded a particularly sharp bend, Jessica gasped. There, in the middle of the road, stood a figure. Her heart pounding, she slowed the car to a stop. It was her. Another Jessica, just like in her dream. But this version of herself was whole, unmarred by the gruesome deaths of her nightmares. She stood there, a sad smile on her face, beckoning Jessica forward. With shaking hands, Jessica put the car in park and got out. The air was preternaturally still, no sound but her own ragged breathing. Who are you? Jessica called out, her voice echoing strangely in the quiet. What do you want? The other Jessica's smile widened. You know who I am. I'm you. The you that remembers. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. Remembers what? The truth, her doppelganger said simply. The truth you've been running from all this time. And suddenly, like a dam breaking, memories flooded Jessica's mind. Not nightmares, but reality. The mountain road, dark and slick with rain. The deer, appearing out of nowhere. The sickening lurch as her car went over the edge. Jessica stumbled, falling to her knees on the asphalt. No, she whispered. No, it can't be. Her other self knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. It's time to stop running, Jessica. Time to accept what happened. Tears streamed down Jessica's face as the full weight of the truth crashed over her. The nightmares hadn't been premonitions. They'd been memories, fractured, distorted by her mind's desperate attempt to protect her from the truth. I died, Jessica choked out. That night on this road. I actually died. Her doppelganger nodded, her eyes full of compassion. Yes, but you also lived. You survived, Jessica. Against all odds, you survived. As if triggered by these words, more memories surfaced. The hospital, The long, painful recovery, the therapists trying to help her process her trauma, and her mind's stubborn refusal to accept what had happened. Why? Jessica sobbed. Why couldn't I remember? Because sometimes the truth is too painful. Her other self said gently, your mind created these nightmares, these repeated deaths, as a way to process what happened without fully accepting it. But you're stronger now. You're ready to face it. Jessica looked up, meeting her own eyes in this strange mirror of herself. What happens now? Her doppelganger smiled, beginning to fade like mist in the morning sun. Now you live, Jessica. You really live. As the apparition disappeared completely, Jessica found herself alone on the mountain road. But she didn't feel alone. She felt whole. For the first time in what she now realized had been months, she felt like herself. With shaky legs, she stood, walking back to her car. As she slid into the driver's seat, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were red from crying, but they were clear, present, alive. Jessica started the engine, taking a deep breath. The road ahead was still winding, still challenging, but it no longer held the power to terrify her. She had faced her greatest fear, her deepest trauma, and she had survived. Again, as she drove towards the lookout point, Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmares that had plagued her weren't gone. She knew. They were part of her now, a reminder of what she had endured, what she had overcome. At the lookout, Jessica parked and got out, walking to the edge to take in the breathtaking view. She pulled out her phone, dialing Emma's number. Jess, Emma's worried voice came through. Are you okay? Did you make it? Jessica smiled, tears pricking at her eyes. But these were tears of relief, of release. I'm okay, Em, she said, her voice strong and sure. I'm better than okay. I'm Elise. As she stood there, looking out over the vast expanse of mountains and sky, Jessica felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The road that had been the source of so much fear and pain had also been the key to her healing. She had died on this mountain, but more importantly, she had lived. And now, finally, she was ready to embrace that life fully, without fear, without reservations. Jessica took one last look at the view, at the road winding back down the mountain. Then she turned back to her car, ready to drive home, ready to truly wake up from the nightmare and start living again. As she pulled away from the lookout, Jessica smiled to herself. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now, she was ready to face whatever twists and turns lay ahead, wide awake and fully alive.